5 armed men cut through her fence on a Tuesday morning, laughing. By Friday, search helicopters were circling the mountains looking for them. They found the trucks first. Engines still warm, doors left open, weapons abandoned in the dirt like the men had simply evaporated into the tree line. Then they found the bodies. No bullet wounds, no signs of struggle, no evidence of anyone else being there at all. Just 5 grown men, experienced hunters who knew these mountains, who had somehow run themselves to death in the dark. The only person who lived on that ridge was a quiet woman named Victoria Hale, and she had never fired a single shot. If this story already has you holding your breath, follow my channel, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The warning signs were not subtle. Victoria Hale had put up 14 of them along the western perimeter alone. Heavy-gauge aluminum, bolted directly into treated timber posts she'd set herself with a manual post driver over the course of 2 weeks in late spring. The signs were printed in black and red. Large font, no decorative border, no softening language. They read, "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." Below that, in slightly smaller text, all activity monitored and recorded. She hadn't bought them online. She'd had them made at a print shop in Casper, drove the 3 hours each way in her truck, paid cash, and didn't make conversation with the woman behind the counter. That was Victoria's way. Efficient, deliberate, nothing wasted. She'd bought the Blackstone Ridge property 11 years ago, when the market was still soft and most buyers took one look at the road conditions in winter and walked away. The main access track climbed 4 miles of switchback gravel from the county road before leveling out onto the plateau where her cabin sat. A 2-room structure she'd expanded herself over 2 summers into something larger and sturdier, with a generator shed, a workshop, and a cold storage unit dug into the slope behind the main building. The whole spread covered just under 900 acres. Timber on the eastern flank, open meadow in the center, and on the north and west edges, a long ridgeline that dropped sharply into the Blackstone drainage below. It was remote the way certain places are remote not just in distance but in feeling, like the land itself had decided it didn't want much company. Victoria was fine with that. She was 44 years old, medium height, lean in the way of someone who worked with their body every day without particularly thinking about it. Her hair was dark brown, kept short and practical. Her hands showed the work. Calluses in the right places, a scar along the left index finger from a fence wire incident 3 years back, nails cut close and clean. She wasn't what people called intimidating on first look. The men at the feed store in Ridgecrest were generally polite to her face and forgot her the moment she left. That suited her fine, too. She'd come to Blackstone Ridge looking for quiet. She'd found it mostly for the first several years. The nearest neighbor was a rancher named Gus Pelham, who ran cattle on the lower pastures 4 miles south, and they had an understanding, a nod, if they crossed paths, help offered and accepted once during a bad winter when his fence line collapsed, and otherwise nothing. No visits, no phone calls, no expectation of anything beyond basic human decency at a distance. Then the hunters started coming. It hadn't begun with Wade Mercer. That was important to understand. The poaching problem in the Blackstone drainage had existed for years before he arrived. Scattered incidents, opportunistic trespassers who cut fences, ran spotlights for elk after dark, left gut piles and shell casings in the meadows. The state game warden, a tired man named Hoskins who covered 4 counties out of a single office in Lander, did what he could, which wasn't much. He'd filed reports, issued a handful of citations, talked to the county sheriff about coordinating patrols. Nothing changed. Victoria had started documenting the incursions in a green hardcover notebook 2 years before Mercer showed up. She was methodical about it. Date, time, location, description of any vehicles or individuals observed, photographs where she'd managed them, GPS coordinates of disturbance sites. She had a system for the cameras too, 12 units positioned along the fence perimeter and at the main trail intersections, motion activated, time-stamped, uploading wirelessly to a local server in her workshop. She checked the footage every morning with her coffee, scrolled through, flagged anything worth noting, and transferred the relevant files to a dedicated hard drive she kept in a waterproof case on the workshop shelf. By the time she'd driven to the sheriff's office in Ridgecrest for the 3rd time in 18 months, she had 2 thick binders of documentation and the storage drive. The deputy who received her, a young man named Cortez who seemed genuinely embarrassed, had looked through the binders and told her the office would follow up. She'd driven home, 3 hours round trip. She'd expected nothing and was not surprised. The following Tuesday, 2 of her Western Perimeter cameras caught a black Ford F-250 with a Wyoming plate she didn't recognize cutting through her fence line at 5:47 in the morning. 3 men got out. One of them, heavy-set, wearing an orange vest over a camo jacket, stopped and looked directly at the nearest camera. Then he gave it the finger and kept walking. She noted the plate in her green notebook. That was the first time she'd seen Wade Mercer. She learned his name through the ordinary process of patience and observation. The plate came back to a business address in Casper, a hunting guide operation called Mercer Outfitters, which had a rudimentary website with a photo of a grinning, broad-faced man in his late 40s standing next to a bull elk with an impressive rack. Guide your own adventure with 25 years of Wyoming backcountry experience. He offered multi-day packages, claimed to know every ridge and drainage in 4 counties, and had a 5-star review from someone named Buckhunter, 1972, that said, Wade was the real deal, no BS, gets you on the animals every time. Maspace. She sat with that information for a while, a professional guide running clients through her land, not some random teenager with a spotlight, someone who did this for money, who had been doing it for years, who considered her 900 acres part of his operational territory regardless of who held the deed. The distinction mattered because it told her something about what she was dealing with. This wasn't ignorance or opportunism. This was deliberate, calculated disregard. Mercer knew exactly where the property lines were. He'd looked at the same county maps she'd looked at when she bought the place. He'd seen her fence and her signs and had made a conscious decision that none of it applied to him. Men like that didn't respond to warnings. They interpreted every unanswered warning as permission. She filed another report with the sheriff's office. She included the plate number, the camera footage, timestamp, and the name of the guide operation. She asked, politely but specifically, whether the Mercer Outfitters business license could be checked against any prior citations for trespass or game violations. Cortez called her back 4 days later. He said Mercer had a couple of old warnings on file, but nothing that rose to a chargeable level. He said the footage was helpful, but that establishing criminal trespass required either a deputy witnessing the violation or a property owner present at the time of the incident. "You're saying I'd need to be standing there," she said. "In practical terms, yes, ma'am. I know that's not what you want to hear." "It isn't. We can increase drive-bys on the county road. The fence cut is 4 miles from the county road." A pause. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." She thanked him and hung up. Then she sat at her kitchen table with the green notebook open and a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, and she thought carefully and without emotion about what her actual options were. She identified 3. The first was legal escalation. Hire an attorney, pursue civil action for trespass, attempt to compel the sheriff's office into more active enforcement. This would cost money and time, and the outcome was uncertain. Mercer clearly had enough local knowledge and confidence to keep operating, which suggested he'd likely navigated legal pressure before. The second was to install more physical deterrence, heavier fencing, lock gates across the main trail approaches, make access inconvenient enough that he'd move to easier territory. The third was to understand what Mercer was actually doing on her land and why, and to gather the kind of documentation that couldn't be dismissed. She circled option 3 because it was the only one she knew from experience actually worked. She started running the ridge before dawn. Not in any obvious tactical way. She wasn't tracking him, not at first. She was simply re-establishing her familiarity with her own terrain, which after 11 years she knew well, but not with the precision she wanted. She began running the perimeter trail at 4:30 in the morning, 5 days a week, regardless of weather. 6 miles of mixed terrain, climbing through timber and across open meadow, dropping into the drainage and back up. She wore trail shoes and carried nothing but a small pack with water, a headlamp, her notebook, and a compact camera. She learned things. She learned that Mercer's group was accessing the property from 3 different cut points on the western fence, not one, which meant they were deliberately varying their route to avoid predictable patrol patterns. She learned they had established a staging area in the timber about a 1/4 mile inside the property line, a flat spot between 2 large Douglas firs where they'd beaten down the undergrowth and left a fire ring of stones. She found shell casings there. 308 Winchester. Premium hunting load, not cheap, and photographed them with a scale reference and logged the coordinates. She found a gut pile in the upper meadow in early October, a large elk calf, illegal to take at that size. She photographed it, flagged the GPS, and called the game warden's office directly. Hoskins came out, took his own photos, collected a tissue sample for the record, and said he'd open a poaching investigation. "You have camera footage of who was in this area?" he asked. "Yes. I'll need copies. I'll have them ready." He looked at her for a moment in the flat way of someone recalibrating an initial impression. "How long have you been dealing with this?" 2 years, more actively the last 6 months. "You should have called me sooner. I called the sheriff's office several times." He nodded slowly. "Yeah." A pause. "All right. I'll look at what you've got." She gave him the footage. He opened the investigation. 2 weeks later, it stalled. The footage showed men in the area, but the image resolution wasn't sufficient to make definitive identifications in a legal proceeding. Hoskins was apologetic. The system was what it was. Victoria thanked him and went home and upgraded 4 of her cameras to units with higher optical zoom and low light capability. She paid for them herself. She did not complain about the cost. In the second week of October, Mercer brought a bigger group. She counted 7 men from the footage, 5 clients, and what looked like 2 guides, all of them well-equipped, moving through her property with the easy confidence of people who expected no consequences. They spent 3 days on her land. The staging area expanded. The fire ring got larger. Someone had dragged in a folding table and 2 camp chairs. They took 2 elk and a deer. She documented the gut piles. She documented the vehicle track where they'd driven a side-by-side ATV through a section of her meadow, churning up the ground cover. She documented the trail camera they'd pulled off one of her fence posts and thrown into the brush 30 feet away. That camera had cost $400. When she retrieved it, the housing was cracked and the lens was scratched, but the unit was still functional. She pulled the SD card and found the last image it had captured before being ripped from its mount, a close-up of a man's face grinning directly into the lens. Wade Mercer, clear as anything, grinning like he thought it was funny. She stared at that image for a long time. Then she printed it and put it in the binder and wrote a note in her green notebook. W. Mercer, direct camera interference, October 14th, 0922. She filed another report. She drove the 3 hours to Ridgecrest, met with the deputy, left copies of everything. On the way back, she stopped at a diner in a small town called Prentice and ate a plate of eggs and toast and drank bad coffee and looked out the window at the gray October sky. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with a kind face, refilled her cup without being asked. "You all right, honey? You look tired." "I'm fine," Victoria said. "Thank you." She drove home. November came cold and early that year. The first snow hit the ridge on November 3rd, 6 inches overnight, and Victoria spent the morning digging out the generator shed and checking the fence line for any damage from a tree limb that had come down in the wind. She found the limb, a big spruce branch across the northwest section, and spent 2 hours with a chainsaw clearing it and patching the fence wire. She was just finishing when she heard the engine. Not a sound that belonged on her land. Too mechanical, too close. The distinctive whine of a gas engine working hard on rough terrain. She set down her wire stretcher and stood still and listened, orienting by ear. Coming from the southwest, moving north. She picked up her tools and walked back to the cabin without rushing. Inside, she checked the live feed on her laptop. The camera nearest the sound was showing movement, a side-by-side ATV with 2 men on it, running through the lower meadow at speed. They'd come through the southwest cut point, which meant they'd crossed a fence she had just repaired 2 weeks ago. She watched them for a few minutes. They were scouting, moving slow through the meadow, stopping, glassing the timber edge with binoculars. She got on the phone, called the sheriff's office, got the overnight answering service, left a message. Then she sat down at her kitchen table and opened her notebook and wrote for 15 minutes, getting the times and descriptions exact. The ATV left an hour later. She went back out in the cold and followed its track in the fresh snow until she found where they'd left the property on the north side. A clean fence cut, wire ends curled back, posts slightly bent. She photographed it, She fixed it. She came back inside and heated soup on the stove and sat by the window watching the snow come down again, and for the first time in a long while she felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not anger. She knew what anger felt like, and this was quieter than that, more settled. Something that sat behind her sternum and didn't move. She decided that evening that she was done waiting for the sheriff's office to solve this for her. The following week, Mercer escalated. It happened on a Wednesday evening at about 9 o'clock. She was in her workshop running diagnostics on the camera network when the front-facing cabin camera picked up headlights coming up the access road. Not one vehicle. 3. She watched them come up the track and park in a ragged line about 40 yards from the cabin. High beams on, pointed directly at her windows. 3 trucks, including the black F250 she'd logged in her first entry about Mercer. She turned off the lights inside the cabin. Doors opened. 7 men got out. She could see them clearly on the thermal imaging unit she'd positioned under the cabin eaves 6 weeks ago. Shapes moving in heat signatures against the cold ground, assembling into a loose group facing the cabin. One of them had a spotlight. He hit it, and the beam swept across the front of her building like something looking for a target. Then Mercer's voice, loud and deliberate, carrying easily through her walls. Hey, sweetheart! You in there?" Laughter from the group. "We just want to talk. Come on out." More laughter. Someone said something she couldn't make out, and there was a burst of louder laughter in response. She sat in the dark workshop and did not move. She noted the time on her watch, 21:07. "You know what your problem is?" Mercer called. "You got too much land and not enough company. We're just trying to help with that." One of the men walked up to the near corner of her cabin and urinated against the wall. She watched him on the thermal, absolutely still. Another one was spray painting something on her outbuilding door. She couldn't see what. The spotlight swept across her windows again. "All right, sweetheart. You stay in there and hide. That's fine. But you better think real hard about what you've been doing with those camera reports and all that. You're making people unhappy." A pause. "People who know where you live." Which, as you can see, we do. That landed with a specific weight, and she recognized it for what it was. Not a general threat, but a calibrated one. He was telling her the location of her home was no longer private. He was telling her the distance she'd maintained between herself and men like him had been closed. She remained still. After another few minutes of noise and trash talk directed at the dark windows, the men got back in their trucks. The spotlight went off. The headlights swung around, and the 3 vehicles moved back down the access track. She sat in the dark for 6 more minutes. Then she got up, turned on a single lamp, and went to the kitchen. She put water on for tea. While it heated, she went to the workshop and checked the recording. All cameras functional, full footage from all angles, audio captured on the front unit. She would have the license plates in the morning's still captures. She wrote in her green notebook for 20 minutes, getting everything exact. Then she drank her tea. Then she went to the back bedroom, moved the bed frame aside, and lifted the section of subflooring she'd cut and fitted with a recessed handle during her second summer on the property. The case underneath was military-grade polymer, lockable, foam-lined. She hadn't opened it in 4 years. She opened it now. Not to take anything out, just to look. Inside, packed with the careful organization of long habit, were things that belonged to a version of herself she had methodically put away when she'd bought this land and decided she was done. Specialized optics with NATO reticle calibration, a compact radio unit with multiband capability, a topographic analysis tool, laminated map sheets of the entire Blackstone Range with hand notation in her own writing, annotated with terrain features, sight lines, acoustic channels, dead ground, a sealed waterproof bag she didn't open. She looked at these things for a moment. Then she closed the case, replaced the flooring, moved the bed back, and went to sleep. In the morning, she drove to Ridgecrest. This time, she did not go to the deputy's office. She went to the county courthouse and asked for the duty judge's clerk. The attorney she retained was a woman named Sandra Polk, who operated out of a small office above a pharmacy in a town called Garfield, 50 miles from Ridgecrest. Polk was in her late 50s, had a reputation for land use and agricultural law, and had a manner that suggested she'd heard most things people could say to her and was not easily impressed by any of them. Victoria sat across from her and laid out the 2 binders and the hard drive and the green notebook. Polk went through these binders methodically, not speaking. She spent a long time on the camera footage timestamps, cross-referencing against the incident log. When she got to the entry from the previous Wednesday, the vehicles, the spotlight, the recorded threat, she set the binder down and looked at Victoria directly. "You have the audio?" "Yes." "The specific statement about people who know where you live is on the recording?" "Clearly." Polk was quiet for a moment. "That's a criminal threat. That's not a civil matter." "I know." "You should have gone to the sheriff's office with this immediately." "I drove to the courthouse." "Why?" Victoria looked at her. "Because the sheriff's office has had 2 years of reports and done nothing. I need a different approach." Polk held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "All right, here's what I can do." She outlined it clearly: an emergency injunction filing, naming Mercer and any identified associates based on the documented trespass pattern and the recorded threat. A formal criminal complaint to the county attorney's office, separate from the sheriff's office chain. A certified letter to Mercer Outfitters documenting all violations and establishing clear legal notice. "This will make him angry," Polk said. "I expect so." "When he gets angry, he may escalate." "Yes." "And you're prepared for that?" Victoria looked at her across the desk for a moment. "Ms. Polk," she said quietly, "I've spent 2 years trying the patient route, filing reports, documenting, giving the system time to work. I'm still being patient." A pause. "But patience and helplessness aren't the same thing." Polk studied her for a moment with the expression of someone revising an assessment. "All right," she said again. She picked up a pen. "Let's get started." The injunction was filed on a Thursday. By Saturday morning, someone had cut every camera on Victoria's western perimeter. All 6 units pulled from their mounts and smashed. She found them in a line along the fence, deliberate, methodical, a message laid out in broken plastic and shattered glass. She photographed the damage. She noted the time. She called Polk, who called the county attorney, who called the sheriff. Deputy Cortez drove out that afternoon. He looked at the destroyed cameras. He looked at Victoria. "You understand this is now property destruction," he said. "That changes the legal classification." "I know," she said. "I want it on the record." "It will be." He paused. "Ms. Hale, is there somewhere else you could stay for a while? Family or—" "No." He looked at the broken cameras again. "This is getting serious." "It's been serious," she said. "I've been trying to tell you that." He had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "Yes, ma'am." After he left, she stood on her porch in the gray November cold and looked out across the meadow toward the tree line. The wind moved through the grass in long, uneven sweeps. She went inside. She moved the bed. She lifted the floor panel. This time, she took the topographic maps out. She spread them on the kitchen table under the lamp and sat down with her coffee and her green notebook, and she began to study her own land with fresh eyes. Not as a rancher assessing a property, but as something older than that, something she'd learned to do in places very different from Wyoming, in terrains that made the Blackstone Ridge look gentle. She studied the ridge lines, the drainage patterns, the timber corridors that funneled movement, the acoustic anomalies created by the canyon walls where sound carried strangely in fog, the 3 high points on the North Ridge that offered overlapping observation of almost the entire plateau. She noted things in her green notebook, not plans exactly, possibilities. She was still at the table when her phone buzzed at 11:30 that night. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. The message was Wade Mercer's voice, and he wasn't laughing this time. "You filed on me. You actually filed on me." A long pause, the sound of wind or road noise in the background. "Lady, I've been hunting this country since before you bought that little plot of yours. You think some paper from a courthouse is going to change that? You think you scared me?" Another pause. "You should be the one that's scared." The message ended. She played it twice. Then she saved it, labeled the file with the date and time, and transferred it to the documentation drive. She looked at the topographic maps still spread across her table, at the ridge lines and the drainage corridors and the 3 high observation points. She thought about what Mercer had said. "You think you scared me?" She closed her notebook. She hadn't been trying to scare him. Not yet. The snow came back hard the following Monday. 6 inches by noon, another 4 by evening, and the access road became a slow white trench between walls of weighted pine. She ran the plow attachment on her truck twice to keep it passable, then gave up and let it drift. She didn't need to go anywhere. She spent the day inventorying, not anxiously, methodically, the way she'd been trained to think about preparation, which was not as a response to fear but as a baseline practice. You maintained your gear, you knew your supplies, you understood your position before you needed to. She checked the generator. Fuel, oil, connections. Good for 3 weeks of hard use. She checked her food stores in the cold unit, checked the propane tanks, checked the medical kit in the workshop cabinet, which was more comprehensive than what most people kept in their homes. Not dramatically so, but with the additions of someone who had learned to account for situations where help was not coming soon. She checked the radio unit from the polymer case, installed fresh batteries, ran a frequency test. It worked. She did not check the weapons that were also in the case because she didn't intend to use them. That was important to be clear about, even if only to herself. What she intended to do was far more specific than violence. She intended to understand the ground better than anyone who entered it. She intended to be, in the specific technical sense she'd learned in a different life, the most informed person in the area of operations. That was all. She went to bed at 9 and set her alarm for 3:30. At 4 in the morning, in the dark and the cold and the deep quiet of the snow, Victoria Hale walked out of her cabin and into her mountains. She carried nothing but her pack, her headlamp, her notebook, the compact radio unit, and the laminated topographic maps. She was gone before dawn, and she did not come back for a very long time. 3 days later, in a hunting camp 4 miles northeast of her fence line, a man named Garrett Voss, one of Mercer's regular guides, picked up his satellite radio at 2 in the afternoon and got no response from the 2 scouts Mercer had sent up the North Ridge that morning. He tried again at 3. Nothing. At 4, with the light already failing and the temperature dropping toward the teens, he radioed Mercer directly. "Wade, can't raise Kofer and Tanner. They were supposed to check the east drainage and be back by 2. A pause. "Try the backup channel," Mercer said. "Already tried." "Nothing." A longer pause. "They probably just got turned around in the snow. Give it another hour." Voss looked at the sky, which was the color of old pewter and dropping fast. "Wade," he said slowly. "Kofer's been coming to these mountains for 10 years. The radio was quiet for a moment. "Give it an hour," Mercer said again, but his voice had shifted, just slightly, just enough. And somewhere on the ridge above the camp, in the timber and the snow and the fading gray light, something moved without sound along a ridgeline that nobody but one person had studied with the kind of attention it deserved. The mountain had started paying attention, and it was no longer indifferent. Kofer and Tanner came back at 6:17 that evening. Voss heard them before he saw them, a crashing through the underbrush at the camp's eastern edge, branches snapping, the particular graceless noise of men moving fast without caring about sound discipline. He had his headlamp on and was at the fire, and he swung the beam toward the sound and found them stumbling into the firelight looking like they'd run 10 miles in wet boots. Kofer, 41 years old, a former outfitter from Riverton who'd guided in this drainage for the better part of a decade, was breathing in the shallow, quick way of someone who'd been moving hard for a while. His face was red from cold and exertion. His jacket had a tear across the left shoulder that hadn't been there when he left. Tanner was younger, late 20s, and he said nothing at all. He sat down on a camp stool and stared at the fire with an expression Voss couldn't quite read. Voss had known Tanner for 3 seasons. He was normally the loudest man in any camp. "What happened?" Voss said. Kofer put his hands out toward the fire. He didn't speak for a moment. "We got turned around," he said finally. "For 4 hours. On terrain you've run 100 times? I said we got turned around." Kofer's voice had an edge in it that was new. He looked up at Voss, and something in his eyes made Voss not push it further. "Radio must have had a dead spot. Happens up on that ridge." Voss looked at Tanner. "You all right?" Tanner didn't answer immediately. He was still looking at the fire. Then he seemed to register the question and glanced up. "Yeah," he said. "Fine. I'm fine." He didn't sound fine. Voss went back to the cook stove and didn't say anything else. But that night, after the others had turned in, He sat outside for a while in the cold and listened to the mountain. The wind was down, the snow had stopped. The ridge above them was perfectly still, and the darkness above the timberline was the absolute kind that doesn't happen near civilization. He thought about Kofer's face in the firelight. Kofer wasn't a man who scared easy. Voss had seen him walk up on a wounded bull once in bad cover, just him and a knife, and come back with blood on his jacket and a story he told like it was mildly inconvenient. He'd been caught in a September blizzard on the Continental Divide and hiked out 12 miles with a broken trekking pole and a client who couldn't stop crying, and he'd treated the whole thing as an annoyance. Whatever had happened up on that ridge today, it had put something in Kofer's eyes that Voss had not seen before. He went to bed at midnight without mentioning it to Mercer. Mercer arrived at this camp the following morning with 2 clients from Texas, a father and son named Braddock, both of them flush with money and expectations, both of them wearing gear that still had the tags removed but showed no real wear. The father, Hale Braddock, was the kind of man who talked about hunting in the language of conquest, who asked questions like, "What's our trophy potential on this ground?" and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone calculating return on investment. The son, Cody, was quieter, maybe 19 or 20. He had the slightly uncomfortable look of someone who was here because his father assumed he wanted to be. Mercer shook hands all around with the easy confidence of a man on his own turf. He had a thick face and a thick neck and hands that showed genuine outdoor work, which at least meant his credentials weren't entirely constructed. He moved through the camp with ownership in every step, touching things, adjusting, making small changes that asserted his authority over the space. He clapped Voss on the shoulder. "Kofer and Tanner make it back okay?" "Yeah, late," said they got turned around. Something moved across Mercer's expression, quick, almost invisible. "Radio was out on that ridge. I'll swap their units out." He said it lightly. Moving on. Voss watched him. "Wade," he said. "Yeah." "How much of this season are we running through the Hale property?" Mercer looked at him steadily. "We're not running through her property. We're running through the Blackstone drainage. The survey lines up here they're contested. Has been for years. She's got fence posts with GPS markers on them. That's not contested." "Garrett," Mercer's voice went flat in a particular way. "I've been guiding this country for 25 years. I know what belongs to who. You just focus on the clients." Voss held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once and went back to the cook stove. He didn't believe a word of it, but he also didn't quit, which was its own kind of moral position, and he knew it. The Braddocks were settled into the camp by early afternoon, and Mercer ran them through the plan for the next 3 days with the polished efficiency of a professional who'd given the same briefing 50 times. Good elk sign in the upper basin. Mule deer moving through the timber bench on the northeast face. Wind pattern favoring a morning approach from the south. Hal Braddock listened and nodded and asked about his odds in the specific way of someone who'd paid for a guarantee without quite saying so. "You get me on legal elk," he said, "and I'm a happy man. You get my boy on something respectable, and I'm a very happy man." "We'll do right by you," Mercer said. Cody Braddock was sitting on a cooler near the tent entrance, turning his rifle over in his hands with the self-conscious care of someone who was still getting used to the weight of it. Voss noticed the scope was a quality unit, Leupold 5th X5, probably cost more than Voss's truck payment, but the way the kid held the rifle said he hadn't put many rounds through it. "First big game hunt?" Voss said. Cody looked up. "Whitetail before. This is my first out west." "Wyoming's different." "Yeah." He looked out at the timber. "Bigger. Everything's bigger up here. Distances are bigger, weather moves faster, you can get turned around faster than you think." He paused. "You stick close to your guide, you'll be fine." Cody nodded, seeming to appreciate the straightforwardness. "You think we're actually going to see anything? My dad paid a lot for this." Voss glanced toward where Mercer was talking with Hal Braddock across the camp. "This is good country," he said carefully. "Lot of elk use this drainage." He didn't say anything else. The first night passed quiet. Victoria had been on the mountain for 36 hours by then, and she had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. She didn't need to. She'd done longer on worse terrain in conditions that made November in Wyoming feel like an inconvenience, and her body still carried the deep architecture of that training, even after years of relative stillness on the ranch. She was currently sitting in a natural depression on the north ridge, just below the crest line, with her back against a granite outcrop that blocked the wind and broke her silhouette from below. She had the topographic map on her knee and a pencil in her hand, and she was making notes by the very limited light of a red-filtered headlamp, red light preserving night vision, an old habit she hadn't thought to unlearn. From this position, she could see the camp's firelight through the timber, about 1 mile and 400 vertical feet below her. She couldn't see the camp clearly, but she could track activity by the light patterns. When people were up, roughly where they moved, when the fire was built up versus allowed to die back. She was not planning anything against them. She was understanding the situation. There was a specific mental discipline to this, a way of looking at ground that wasn't about emotion or grievance, but about information. Where are the people? How many? What are their patterns? What does the terrain do to them that they may not be aware of? Where are the lines of movement they'll naturally follow versus the ones they'll avoid? Where does visibility degrade? Where does sound carry, and where does it get absorbed? She'd spent a large portion of her adult life learning to read ground this way, and the muscle memory of it came back without effort, which was the point of that kind of training. You didn't think about it. You just saw. The camp below had 6 people now. She'd counted entries and exits against the firelight over the past 8 hours. Mercer plus what looked like 2 guides and 3 clients. They were running a conventional big game setup, wall tent, cook stove, a small generator that ran about 4 hours in the evening, 2 ATVs staged at the eastern edge of the camp. They were also, by her estimation, camped approximately 300 yards outside her western fence line, which was technically legal. But she'd watched 2 of them cross her fence that afternoon, moving up toward the east drainage that her cameras had documented elk using repeatedly through October. She didn't have cameras on that particular run anymore, because Mercer's people had destroyed the units there 3 weeks ago. She noted it in her notebook. Time, direction, description. Then she folded the maps, turned off the headlamp, and sat in complete darkness listening to the mountain. After a while she heard it, the sound she'd been tracking since she came up here. It happened twice a night, in the deep cold hours, at irregular intervals. A sound that wasn't quite wind, and wasn't quite an animal, and wasn't quite anything a person who hadn't spent time in this specific terrain would be able to categorize correctly. The canyon below her ridge had an acoustic property she'd discovered by accident in her 3rd winter on the property. The rock formation on the north wall, a curved granite face she thought of as the amphitheater, created a specific echo under certain temperature and wind conditions. Sound generated near the camp, if it hit that rock face at the right angle, returned from a completely unexpected direction with enough delay to seem like a separate source. She had not designed this. She'd simply found it. She put a small notation on her map. Then she sat with it for a while, thinking. In the morning, she descended the north side of the ridge into a drainage she knew well, followed a frozen creek bed east for about 2 miles, and came up through the timber onto a bench that overlooked the east drainage where the elk were moving. She was there well before first light. She found a position, down behind a deadfall, good cover, excellent sight lines, and settled in and waited. At 7:40, she heard them coming, 2 men on foot, moving carefully, trying to be quiet and not entirely managing it. They were working the wind right, she'd give them that, coming in from the south with the breeze in their faces. But they were reading the terrain wrong, following the obvious route along the drainage floor rather than the bench above it, which meant they were going to push the elk up and left before they ever got in range. She watched them work through her binoculars. The lead man was Kofor. She recognized him from her camera footage. Same jacket, same deliberate way of moving, like someone who knew what he was doing even when he was doing it wrong. The man behind him was unfamiliar. Big, broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of technical layering system that suggested money rather than experience. A client. The father, based on the bearing. They stopped about 200 yards short of where she'd have stopped if she were hunting this bench. Kofor glassed the upper drainage. She watched him see what she'd already seen. Nothing. The elk had already moved. Kofor turned and said something to the client. The client responded, and from the body language, she could read the shape of it. Where are they? I don't know. They were here yesterday. Wind must have shifted early. The client put his hands on his hips. Even at 200 yards, she could read the frustration. They stood there for a few minutes. Then Kofor made a hand signal, "Let's move," and they began working north along the drainage, which was exactly the wrong direction if they wanted to cut off the elk's most likely movement corridor. She watched them go. She was lying perfectly still in the snow behind the deadfall, and they passed within maybe 80 yards of her position, and neither of them looked her way. The client was watching his feet, Kofor was watching the ridgeline. Neither of them looked at the deadfall. She stayed put for 15 minutes after they were out of auditory range, then rose quietly and moved through the timber in the opposite direction, east and up, along a line she'd mapped weeks ago. She reached the elk in under an hour, a group of 7, 3 cows and 4 bulls, 2 of the bulls mature enough to be worth looking at. They were feeding in a south-facing clearing, using the thin winter sun to warm themselves, unhurried. She watched them from 60 yards, completely still, for almost 20 minutes. Then she pulled out her notebook and wrote a description of each animal, estimated age, antler configuration, body condition, behavior. Old habit. She'd kept this kind of log on the ranch's elk population since her second year, partly because she cared about the herd, and partly because it gave her something she'd learned to value above most other things in the field. A detailed, current, accurate picture of what was actually happening on her ground. The bulls fed and moved and disappeared into the upper timber. She noted the time and closed her notebook. Then she turned and started back the long way around, avoiding the route Kofor and the client were on, moving through country that she was reasonably sure they didn't know existed. Well, that afternoon she was back at the cabin long enough to eat a real meal, canned soup, crackers, a pot of black coffee, and to check the remaining cameras. 2 incidents overnight on the northwest perimeter. A vehicle approached that had stopped at the fence line and then reversed, and a single individual on foot who'd crossed at the southwest cut point, walked 100 yards in, and then turned around and went back. The individual on foot had stopped and looked directly at the camera she'd installed 2 weeks ago, at a different height than the previous unit, high enough to capture a clear face even in the dark. She didn't recognize him. New addition to Mercer's operation, probably. She added him to the documentation drive and sent the file to Polk's office with a note. Then she went back out. Bullshit. On the third day, things shifted. She was on the south ridge moving along a rock band that gave her a view of the main approach trail into the upper basin when her radio crackled. She'd been monitoring the frequency she'd identified as Mercer's camp channel since the first night. She wasn't broadcasting, just listening. Open channel, no encryption, sloppy. "Garrett, we got a problem," Mercer's voice, tighter than she'd heard it before. "Go ahead," Voss replied. "Braddock Sr. is done. Says he's seen 2 guides and paid $3,500, and he hasn't had a shot opportunity in 2 days. He's talking about pulling out and wants a partial refund." A pause. "What do you want me to do about it?" "I want you to get him on a bull today. I don't care how. Take him through the upper meadow on the Hale ground if you have to. There's a satellite group up there that's barely been pressured." Voss didn't respond immediately. "Garrett, I heard you. The Hale woman hasn't been seen in 3 days. Her truck's been in the yard. She's not going anywhere in this weather. Wade, the injunction is a piece of paper. Get Braddock on a bull." The radio went quiet. Victoria held the radio unit in her gloved hand and looked out at the south ridge for a moment. She noted the time, 13:42. Then she put the radio back in her pack and changed her route. She reached the upper meadow from the north, the hard way, climbing through boulder field and wind-scoured rock above the timberline, and coming down through the backside of the basin on a route that didn't show on any commercial map. It took her 2.5 hours, longer than she'd wanted. By the time she reached the meadow's upper edge and settled into a position among the rocks above the northern tree line, the light was already going soft. She didn't have long to wait. Voss and Hal Braddock came into the meadow from the south at 4 o'clock, moving carefully along the western edge where the timber gave them cover. She watched them through her binoculars from 300 yards. Voss was moving like someone who didn't feel good about being here. Quick glances, checking behind him, no real focus on the hunting. Braddock was locked on the meadow, doing everything Voss probably told him to do. Slow movement, staying in shadow, watching the far tree line. There were elk in this meadow. She could see them from her position. The satellite group Mercer had referenced, 6 animals in the far corner where the meadow bent around a spruce thicket. Voss and Braddock were going to see them in a few minutes. She sat with her hands in her lap and thought about what she was doing here. She hadn't come to stop the shot. She had no authority to do that, no legal standing to intercept a hunt in progress, and she knew that. What she had was a camera, good position, and a recording of Mercer ordering his guide to run clients through her property in clear violation of the active injunction. She pulled the compact camera from her pack. Long lens. She began documenting. Voss and Braddock at the meadow edge. Timestamp. GPS location embedded in the file metadata. Voss pointing towards the elk. Braddock raising his rifle. She kept the camera steady and shot continuously. Then something happened that she hadn't planned for. Braddock fired. The shot was clean. She heard the impact, watched one of the elk animals drop, saw the others scatter north into the timber. Voss put a hand on Braddock's shoulder. Braddock lowered his rifle and stood up straighter with the unmistakable posture of a man who'd gotten what he came for. She lowered the camera. She had clear documentation of a kill on her property by a client of Mercer Outfitters in direct violation of an active court injunction. She had GPS metadata in the photographs. She had the audio from Mercer's radio traffic ordering the guide to bring the client onto her land. That was the case. Right there. That was what 18 months of documentation and 2 binders of reports had been building toward. She was also aware, watching Voss and Braddock begin moving toward the downed animal across her meadow, that she felt something complicated. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something more tired than that. She stayed on the rocks until full dark, watching through her binoculars as the 2 men field-dressed the elk and began the slow process of getting the quarters out. They were going to need the ATV for this, and that meant a longer exposure, more time on her property, more documentation opportunity. She took photographs at intervals. She did not approach or reveal herself. At 7 in the evening, in the full dark, an ATV came up from the south with a second man. She couldn't identify him from this distance. They finished the pack out by headlamp, loaded the quarters, and were gone by 8:15. She sat alone in the dark meadow for a while after they left. The snow under where the elk had fallen was dark, in the center of the thermal image on her camera's live display, still warm from the animal's heat. She walked over and stood there, looking at it for a moment. She'd watched this particular group through October and into November. She'd cataloged every animal in it. She knew the bull, had photographs of him from 4 different dates, aging him at 5.5 years based on antler spread and body mass. He'd wintered on this meadow twice. She stood there longer than was strictly necessary. Then she turned and walked back up through the rocks toward the north ridge, moving in the dark without a headlamp, knowing every step of the ground by feel. Bamat. She called Polk at 7 the next morning. I have documentation of a kill on my property last night, clear GPS verification, time-stamped photographs, and radio audio of Mercer ordering his guide to bring the client onto my land in specific contravention of the injunction. Polk was quiet for a moment. Where are you right now? The cabin. Are you all right? I'm fine. Victoria. A pause. Did you spend 3 days on the mountain alone? I was documenting activity. In November. In the Blackstone drainage. I know the terrain. Another pause. Different in quality from the first one. Polk was reassessing something, same way she had in the office that first day. All right, I need those files. Can you upload them securely to the firm's transfer portal? Yes. I'm going to file for contempt of court today. Mercer violated an active injunction. That's not a civil matter anymore. That's a court matter. The county attorney will have to move on this. Good. This is going to get uglier before it gets better. You understand that? Victoria stood at her kitchen window looking out at the meadow in the gray morning light. The snow showed the ATV track from the night before, cutting across from the southern tree line. I understand that, she said. Is there anything you haven't told me about what you were doing up there? A brief pause. I was observing and documenting, Victoria said. That's all. Polk seemed to weigh that. Okay, get me those files. She hung up and transferred the files and then stood at the window a while longer with her coffee. She thought about Voss, about the way he'd moved in the meadow, looking over his shoulder, no real commitment to what he was doing. A man who was somewhere he didn't want to be, doing something he didn't feel good about, for reasons that probably came down to paycheck and proximity. She'd known men like Voss. Most of the people who did bad things were men like Voss. Not true believers, not architects, just people who didn't find the exit in time. She thought about the bull elk. She thought about the injunction and the court filing and the county attorney's office, and whether any of it would actually move fast enough to matter. She thought about Mercer's voice on the radio. The Hale woman hasn't been seen in 3 days. He thought she was hiding. He thought the silence was fear. She went to her workshop and pulled the polymer case out from under the bench where she'd moved it 2 days ago. She opened it and sat looking at the topographic maps, now covered in her own annotation. 2 weeks of observation reduced to marks on laminated paper, routes and timing, and positions and acoustic anomalies, and the specific geometry of a ridgeline that she now knew the way she knew her own kitchen. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. No preamble, no signature. You're making this more expensive than it needs to be. Last chance to walk away from this property. We'll make it worth your while. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and looked at her maps. She didn't respond. She thought about what Polk had said. Uglier before it gets better. She thought about the convoy of 3 trucks coming up her access road in the dark, the spotlight sweeping her windows, the specific way Mercer had used the word scared. He'd been sending messages for 3 months. Every cut fence, every destroyed camera, every violation. The message was the same thing each time. You should be afraid of us. You should leave. She picked up a pencil. On the topographic map, she drew a small X at the acoustic formation she'd been thinking about since the first night on the ridge. Then another X at the western timber access she'd identified as their most likely approach route to the upper basin. Then a line, careful and deliberate, connecting 3 observation points on the north ridge that gave overlapping coverage of the entire plateau without any of them being visible from below. She sat back and looked at what she'd drawn. It wasn't a plan, it was an understanding of how someone who knew this mountain, who had learned it in the specific way she had learned it, not as a hunter or a rancher, but as something else, something she hadn't been called in 11 years, could make 500 acres feel like a maze to people who thought they owned it. She closed the map. Outside, the wind came back across the ridge, moving through the fence line with a low sound like a held breath. She looked at Mercer's text again. Last chance to walk away. She put the phone in her pocket. She went and made herself eat something. 2 eggs, toast, more coffee. And she sat at the kitchen table and ate it slowly and without particular emotion, the way she'd learned to eat before operations when appetite was something you managed rather than felt. Her hands were steady. They'd always been steady. That was the thing nobody looking at her in a feed store or a courthouse waiting room would know. The thing that existed quietly underneath the ordinary surface of her life on this ranch. That she had been in places where the steadiness of her hands had mattered in the specific and irreversible way that very few things actually matter, and her hands had never once failed her. She washed her plate, she put on her jacket and her boots, she picked up her pack, and she went back out into the cold and the wind and the wide white silence of her mountain, moving without sound into the timber, disappearing from the visible world as completely as if she had never been there at all. In the camp 4 miles northeast, at that same moment, Kofor was sitting on a camp stool trying to describe to Mercer what had happened on the ridge 2 days ago, and finding that the description kept coming out wrong. "I'm telling you we weren't lost," he said. "We knew where we were. We just kept..." It was like the terrain wasn't where it was supposed to be. Sound was off. Visibility was fine, but I kept thinking there was something in the peripheral. Mercer stared at him. "You're telling me you spooked yourself?" "I'm telling you something wasn't right up there." "You've guided this drainage for 8 years. "I know." Kofor said it flatly, the way you said something when the knowing of it was exactly the problem. "I know that." Mercer looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked up at the ridgeline above the camp, where the timber met the rock band and the rock band rose into the gray sky. He looked up there for a while. "She's one woman," he said, "alone, on 900 acres. Kofor didn't say anything. "One woman," Mercer said again. But he was still looking at the ridge. Mercer looked at the ridge for a long time. Then he went inside the wall tent and zipped it shut, and didn't come out for an hour. And when he did, his face had settled into something harder and more deliberate than the loose confidence he usually wore. He called the camp together at midday. Voss, Kofor, Tanner, and the 2 remaining clients, the Braddock kid, and a man named Pulaski, who'd arrived 2 days ago and barely spoken to anyone. Mercer stood at the cook table with a mug in his hand and laid it out the way he laid out hunt plans. Direct, no wasted language, expect compliance. We're moving our timeline up, he said. 3 more days on this drainage and then we pull out. I want the upper basin covered morning and evening, both access routes. Kofer, you take the east bench with Pulaski. Voss, you've got the meadow route with the Braddock kid. I'll run the north approach solo. Voss set down his coffee. The north approach goes through the Hale property. I know where it goes. Wade, we've got a contempt filing pending. Polk sent the county attorney's office the radio transcript. The tent went quiet in a specific way. Mercer looked at Voss with an expression that had no warmth in it at all. Where'd you hear that? She copied the filing to Mercer Outfitters' registered address. Came through on my phone this morning. Voss held his gaze. I'm on that radio transcript, Wade, by name. You followed my direction. Yeah, and now my name's in a court document. It'll get thrown out. Maybe, maybe not. Voss set his mug on the table. I've got 3 kids in Riverton. I'm not losing my guide license over this. The silence stretched. Cody Braddock was looking at the tent floor. Pulaski was looking at nothing in particular in the practiced way of someone who'd learned not to be in the middle of things. Kofer, sitting on his cot, said nothing. He was looking at the mug in his hands. Mercer put his own mug down. Anyone else want to talk about their feelings? Nobody answered. Then here's where we are. We've got clients who paid good money. We've got 3 days of season left. We're going to do our jobs. He looked at Voss specifically. After that, we pack out and let the lawyers handle the lawyers. Voss picked up his mug and walked outside. Mercer watched him go. Kofer, still looking at his hands, said quietly, You should have seen her camera setup, Wade. The one she had on the North Ridge access. What about it? It wasn't a trail cam. It was a different kind of unit, military-grade housing, not something you buy at Cabela's. The tent was very quiet. I only saw it because I was looking for it, Kofer said. I'd never have found it otherwise. He finally looked up. She positioned it at exactly the right angle to cover the approach without any visibility from below. That's not a rancher's instinct. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. She's a veteran, he said. She's got some gear. That doesn't make her, I know what it doesn't make her. Kofer stood up. I'm just telling you what I saw. He went outside too. Mercer stood alone in the wall tent with the sound of the wind against the canvas and the smell of camp coffee and wood smoke, and he looked at the ridgeline through the tent's small window panel. One woman. Alone. He picked up his radio. Victoria heard the shift in their radio traffic before she understood what it meant. She'd been on the North Ridge since before dawn, in the same depression she'd used the first night, with the thermal monocular and the topographic maps in her notebook. The temperature had dropped to 4 degrees overnight, and the cold had a quality to it that wasn't uncomfortable so much as absolute. The kind of cold that simplified everything, that stripped away whatever wasn't essential and left you with only the relevant. The radio traffic from Mercer's camp had been routine all morning. Assignment confirmations, weather checks, the ordinary back and forth of a hunting operation. But just after noon it went quiet for almost 2 hours, and when it came back the frequency discipline was different. Shorter transmissions. Code language she didn't have the key for. Not military code, just the informal shorthand of men who'd worked together long enough to not need full sentences. North position? Confirm. Confirmed. Moving at 1400. Voss, hold east until I signal. Copy. She sat with the radio in her lap and looked at the map. North position. Moving at 1400. That put someone on the north approach trail inside her fence line in approximately 90 minutes. She looked at the ridge below her. The north approach trail came up through the timber bench, crossed the fence at a cut point she'd patched 3 times, and then climbed through a series of switchbacks to the upper basin. It was the most direct route to the upper meadow from the camp's position, the one she would have used if she were running hunters into that basin and didn't care about property lines. She thought about Kofer's face in the firelight on the first night. She thought about Mercer's voice on the radio, the Hale woman hasn't been seen in 3 days, and the particular confidence in it, the assumption that invisibility meant absence. She checked her watch. 12:22. She began moving. Not toward the trail. Parallel to it, 200 yards north, along the rock band above the timberline where movement left no track in the snow, and where her silhouette against the sky was broken by the irregular profile of the granite. She moved quickly and without wasted motion, covering ground in the specific way she'd learned in mountains that were less forgiving than these, a controlled efficiency that wasn't quite a run but wasn't quite a walk, eating distance without announcing it. She'd been in this specific terrain for 6 days now, and her body had readapted to it in the way bodies do when the original conditioning was thorough enough. The altitude was manageable. The cold was manageable. The pack weight was distributed correctly across hips and shoulders, and her feet found the right placement on mixed snow and rock without her having to think about it. She reached the observation point above the trail's upper switchback at 12:58. She settled into a position behind a boulder the size of a car, checked her angles, confirmed her sightlines. At 14:03, Wade Mercer came up through the trees. He was alone, moving carefully, rifle across his body in a carry position that suggested he was serious about this approach. No clients. Solo. He was dressed in quality camo with good layering visible at the collar and wrists, and he moved like someone who actually knew the terrain, better than she'd given him credit for from a distance. He paused at the fence cut, looked both directions along the fence line, and then stepped through with the practiced ease of a man who'd done it many times. She watched him come up the switchbacks. He was 60 yards below her when he stopped. She wasn't sure what made him stop. She hadn't moved. She was behind the boulder, completely still, and the wind was quartering from the northwest, taking her scent away from him. There was no logical reason for him to stop at that specific point, but he did. He stood on the trail and looked up toward the rock band. She watched him through the monocular. His face was turned upslope, scanning, not finding anything. He was looking too high, above the granite where the sky was empty, but something had reached him, some animal awareness that the ground above him was occupied. She didn't move. After a long 30 seconds, he started up again. He passed within 50 yards of her position without knowing she was there. She let him go. She waited 10 minutes. Then she moved east along the rock band to the second observation point, the one that covered the basin approach and the upper meadow simultaneously. She reached it, settled, and glassed the basin. Mercer appeared at the meadow's eastern edge 12 minutes later. He stood at the tree line and glassed the meadow for a while. She could see him clearly from here, the way he held himself, the slight forward lean of someone trying to read ground. The meadow was empty of elk. The satellite group had moved after the previous evening's shot, which she'd expected, and had pushed north into the upper timber where they'd be harder to access. Mercer spent about 20 minutes working the meadow edge, checking the northern timberline, moving in and out of cover. He was a competent hunter. She could see that clearly now, watching him work, the way he used the wind, the way he read sign, the patience in his glassing. In a different context on legitimate ground, he'd have been exactly what his website claimed. Experienced, skilled, worth hiring. He just believed that the world's legitimate ground included whatever ground he decided he wanted to use. She photographed him at the meadow edge. GPS metadata, timestamp. Mercer in her upper basin, solo, rifle in hand, in direct violation of an injunction that had been active for 3 weeks. She had everything she needed. She was about to start moving back toward the north when her radio caught a burst of traffic that stopped her. Wade, Voss. You need to hear this. A pause, Voss's voice carrying a quality she hadn't heard in the previous transmissions. Not angry, something closer to shaken. Kofor just came off the east bench. He says I don't know how to say this. He says there's marking on the trail up there. Not natural. Somebody's been through that route and left indicators. Mercer's voice slightly flattened by the radio. What kind of indicators? Survey markers. But not survey markers. Different. Kofor says they're range markers, for distance estimation. A pause. She's been ranging the approaches, Voss said. Kofor knows what those markers mean. He did 2 tours with the 82nd. He knows range markers when he sees them. The radio was quiet for what felt like a long time. She sat behind the granite and looked at the meadow where Mercer was standing very still now, his radio to his ear. Wade, Voss said. Who is this woman? She watched Mercer lower the radio slowly. He turned from the meadow and looked out across the basin, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He turned and looked directly at the rock band above him. Not the same unfocused look from the switchback. This was a directed look. Deliberate. the look of someone who had received new information and was recalibrating what it meant. He was looking at exactly the wrong section of rock. She was 100 yards east of where his eyes landed. But the direction was right. The intention was right. She understood then that something had changed in him. The casual arrogance of the past weeks, the spotlight on her windows, the cameras smashed and left in a line, the text message, last chance, that had come from a man who was certain he understood the situation, certain of the asymmetry between himself and the quiet woman on the ridge. He was no longer certain. She watched him for another moment. Then she made a decision. She keyed the radio. Mr. Mercer. The transmission was 3 words, and she released the key immediately. In the meadow below, she watched him go completely still. Mr. Mercer, she said again, you're currently standing approximately 40 meters inside my property line. You're in violation of an active injunction. I have photographs with GPS metadata and timestamps. A pause. I'd suggest you leave the way you came in. The radio was silent. She watched him turn slowly, scanning the rock band above him with the focused attention of a man who understood, finally, that the situation was not what he'd thought it was. Where are you? He said. His voice was flat, careful. That doesn't matter. Leave my property, Mr. Mercer. A long silence. You've been up here the whole time, he said. Not a question. She didn't answer. She watched him take one more look at the rock band, closer this time, moving his scan methodically east along the granite, and she stayed completely still and watched him not find her. Then he turned and walked back toward the tree line the way he'd come. She remained in position until he was gone from sight. Then she sat for a while in the cold and the quiet and looked at the empty meadow. Her hands were steady. What happened next happened fast, and not entirely the way she'd planned. She'd expected Mercer to pull back, to regroup, contact Polk's counterpart, start managing the legal exposure. That was the rational move, and whatever else he was, Mercer was rational enough to have run a successful business for 25 years. She hadn't accounted adequately for his pride. She was descending the north ridge at dusk, moving carefully on the icy rock, when she heard the ATVs, not one key, 2, running hard from the south, engines loud in the cold air, and they were coming up the main access route toward her cabin. She changed direction without stopping, cut east across the ridge, found the steep timber line, went down through it faster than she should have in the fading light, branches catching at her pack, footing uncertain on the snow-covered slope. She came out of the timber onto the plateau above the cabin and crouched at the edge of the tree line. 2 ATVs parked at the cabin's south side. 4 men she could see from here, 2 from each ATV. One of them had a bolt cutter and was working on the padlock to her generator shed. She watched. Another man was at the cabin's front door. He tried the handle, locked. He took a step back and put his foot to it, and the door held, because she'd reinforced the frame 2 years ago specifically against this kind of thing. And he stumbled slightly from the failed kick and said something she couldn't hear. She counted the men again, 4 visible. She didn't know where Mercer was. She didn't know if there were others she wasn't seeing. She pulled her phone and called Polk's emergency number. Polk answered on the 3rd ring. 4 men on my property. They're attempting to enter the cabin and generator shed. Are you safe? I'm at the tree line. They don't know I'm here. Don't approach them. I'm calling the county attorney and the sheriff simultaneously. Stay on the line. I need you to call the game warden, too. Hoskins. Tell him I need him at the property as soon as possible. Why Hoskins? Because he has citation authority, and the sheriff has jurisdiction, and I want both on scene. A brief pause. All right. The man at the generator shed had the padlock off. He swung the door open and went inside. A few seconds later, her generator started. Not the way she started it, rough and sudden, and she heard the revs run too high before settling, which told her he didn't know the correct startup sequence, and had probably just shaved months off its service life. The cabin lights came on. She didn't move from the tree line. Polk came back on. Sheriff's office is sending a car, 45 minutes, minimum. The county road is 40 minutes from the access gate, then 4 miles of track. I know, it's what we have. Are you? Polk paused. Victoria, are you armed? The question sat there for a moment. I'm not going to need to be, she said. That's not what I asked. She didn't answer it. She watched the 4 men in and around her cabin. One of them had found her firewood pile and was sitting on it, smoking. Another had come back out of the generator shed and was talking on a phone. The man who'd tried to kick in the door had apparently gone around to the workshop entrance. She thought about what was in the workshop. The polymer case was under the bench, locked. They'd need to know what they were looking for and have the right tools to get into it, which she doubted. But the documentation drive was on the shelf, the external hard drive with 3 months of camera footage and her notebook scans. She made a decision. She circled east, staying in the timber, moving on a route that kept the cabin between her and the man sitting on the firewood pile. She came around to the workshop's north face, which had no windows and wasn't visible from the cabin's main approach side. The workshop's rear panel had a seam in it that she'd never gotten around to sealing properly. She'd thought about it as a construction defect for 2 years. She was thinking about it now as a way in. She moved to the panel, worked her fingers into the seam, pulled it open 6 inches. Enough. She got the pack off and slid through sideways and was inside, crouching in the dark smell of sawdust and machine oil. She could hear the man in the workshop. Drawers opening, something being moved across the workbench. A light. She could see the beam sweeping under the interior door. She found the documentation drive on the shelf by touch, slid it off, put it in her jacket pocket. She found her backup notebook, a second green hardcover she kept as a duplicate, and put that in the pocket too. Then she turned to go back out the panel seam and nearly walked into the man who had come around to the workshop's north face to relieve himself against the wall. They were 3 feet apart. He was in his early 30s, heavy, bearded, and the shock of finding her there registered on his face in slow stages. Surprise first, then a rapid reassessment, then something she couldn't quite read. She stayed completely still. "Hey," he started. "You're trespassing," she said. Quiet. Factual. "There are law enforcement officers en route to this property right now. I'd strongly recommend you go tell your friends that." He stared at her. She looked back at him. She didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She just held his eyes with the particular quality of stillness that she'd learned in very different circumstances. The kind that wasn't passive, that wasn't fearful, that was simply the absolute absence of uncertainty. Whatever he saw on her face made him take a step back. "Wade's not going to like..." "I'm not concerned with what Wade likes," she said. "Go tell them." He went. She heard him moving around the cabin's south side. Heard him say something, too quiet to make out, and heard the sudden change in the quality of activity around the cabin. Movement consolidating, voices dropping. She came back through the panel seam, shouldered her pack, and moved back to the tree line. She found a position with a clear view of the cabin approach and settled in. 11 minutes later, Mercer's voice from the south side of the cabin, loud enough to carry, "Victoria Hale, I know you're out there." She didn't answer. "Come on, let's talk like adults." She watched him through the monocular. He'd come around from the south side and was standing in the open ground between the cabin and the generator shed, hands at his sides, head turning slowly as he scanned the darkness around the tree lines. "You got my text. You know I can make this simple. Fair price, clean deal. You walk away with something instead of nothing." She tracked him through the monocular. "Or we can keep doing this." His voice changed slightly, the reasonable tone developing an edge underneath it. "But you should understand that I'm not the only one with an interest in this property. There are people involved in this situation that you haven't met yet, people who are a lot less patient than I am." She noted that for the documentation. From inside the cabin, she heard something break, glass by the sound of it. Mercer glanced toward the cabin and said something sharp she couldn't hear, and the noise stopped. She called Polk. "They're still on the property. Mercer is making verbal threats about undisclosed associates. Something just broke inside the cabin." She kept her voice at the same level she'd used to read weather data. "How far out is the sheriff?" 22 minutes. Polk's voice had its own controlled quality. "Victoria, I need you to stay visible enough that they know you're documenting, but do not put yourself in a position where, I know, these are not rational actors under pressure. I'm aware. Your safety matters more than the documentation." "I have what I need," she said. "The rest is already sent to your office." A pause. "What do you mean, already sent?" "I uploaded everything this morning. The photographs from the basin, the radio transcripts, the contempt documentation. It's all at your firm." She paused. "Whatever happens tonight, the case exists." Polk was quiet for a moment. "You planned for this." Victoria didn't answer that. She watched Mercer pace the open ground in front of her cabin. She watched one of the other men come out of the cabin carrying something, she couldn't tell what from here, and drop it deliberately on the porch. She watched a third man kick over her firewood stack, which was petty and meant something about his emotional state. She thought about the ATVs, 2 of them, which meant 4 men could leave simultaneously. She didn't know if they'd do that voluntarily or if they'd wait for the sheriff and try to make the whole thing look like nothing. What she knew was that her documentation was secure. Her drive was in her pocket. Her case was intact. She also knew, in a way she hadn't known when she first opened the polymer case 5 days ago, something about herself that she'd been carefully avoiding since she came to this mountain, that the life she'd buried when she bought this land hadn't actually gone anywhere. It had simply been waiting, patient and still, the way she was patient and still, for circumstances that called it forward. She hadn't wanted those circumstances. But she was not, in the cold and the dark, with 4 trespassers in her cabin and a sheriff 45 minutes away, afraid of them. That was the thing nobody was going to understand about what happened over the following days. They were going to look for a motive, anger, grievance, revenge, and they weren't going to find one because those weren't the operating conditions. The operating condition was something simpler and older and harder to explain to someone who hadn't been trained to it. She knew this ground. She knew it at a level these men did not, and could not without months of the kind of deliberate study she'd given it. She knew its acoustic properties, and its sight lines, and its movement corridors, and the places where the cold settled, and the places where it didn't, and the way sound carried down certain drainages in fog, and why. She knew where you could move at night without a light, and where you'd break an ankle trying, and she knew which ridge lines, in which weather, produced the specific combination of wind pattern and echo and failing visibility that turned experienced outdoorsmen into disoriented, frightened people making bad decisions in the dark. This was not magic. This was information. Carefully gathered, patiently compiled, and now completely current. That was all she had. That was enough. She was still in the tree line, still watching the cabin, when her phone buzzed. Not Polk, an unknown number, but a local area code. She answered. "Ms. Hale," a man's voice, older, careful. "My name is Reyes, Deputy Reyes. I'm 6 minutes out on the county road. Can you tell me what we're walking into?" She told him, concisely. 4 individuals, 2 ATVs, active trespass, property damage, the specific violation status relative to the existing injunction, and the fact that she was currently in the eastern tree line with a clear view of the cabin. A brief pause. "You're in the tree line?" "Yes. And the 4 individuals are currently 3 visible in the front area, 1 unaccounted for." She checked the monocular. "Mercer is at the cabin entrance. 2 others near the ATVs. Is Mercer armed?" She glassed him carefully. "I can't confirm a firearm. He's wearing a jacket that could conceal a sidearm." Another pause. "You sound like you've done this before." She said nothing. "Okay," Reyes said. "I'm going to ask you to stay in the tree line until I'm on scene and can see you. Don't approach the cabin. Can you confirm you're okay with that?" "Yes." "Good. I'll be there in..." She heard the pitch of his engine change. 5 minutes now. I'm pushing it." She stayed in the tree line. She watched Mercer lean against her cabin doorframe and look out at the dark. She watched the 2 men near the ATVs talking with their hands in the way of men who were running out of patience with a situation that wasn't resolving the way they'd expected. She had the thought that she should feel something more than she did. Anger or fear, or the specific kind of dark satisfaction that she'd heard some people describe in situations like this. But what she felt was what she'd felt all week on the mountain. That settled thing behind her sternum, immovable and clear, that wasn't quite any emotion she had a name for. She'd come back here to live quietly. She had done nothing but try to live quietly. She was done apologizing for the fact that she happened to be very, very good at the alternative. The sound of Reyes's vehicle came up the access road. She heard it a full 2 minutes before the headlights appeared, which told her the deputy had turned off his lights before the final approach, which told her in turn that he had some field sense. She watched Mercer hear it too, watched his posture change, watched him make a calculation, watched him decide. He turned and said something to the 2 men at the ATVs, and they moved, quickly, loading into the vehicles, The engines starting before the doors were fully shut. Mercer took one last look at the dark around the cabin, and she had the absolute conviction that in that last look he was searching for her, specifically that whatever his men had reported about the woman in the workshop doorway had rearranged something fundamental in how he understood this situation. He got on the second ATV. They were moving south down the access track before Reyes's headlights swept the cabin. She stepped out of the tree line. Reyes hit his lights and brought the vehicle to a stop 30 feet from the cabin and got out with one hand on his holster and the other flagging her, and she raised both hands and walked toward him slowly, and when she was close enough for him to see her clearly, she stopped. "Victoria Hale," she said. He was in his 40s, compact, serious. He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating look of someone trying to calibrate what he was dealing with. "They're gone," she said. "South on the access track, 2 ATVs, 4 individuals. One is Wade Mercer. He'll be in your system." Reyes keyed his radio, called it in. Then he looked back at her. "You okay?" "Yes." "You need medical attention?" "No." He looked at the cabin. The broken window she could now see clearly from the porch, the firewood scattered across the yard, the generator shed hanging open, the thing on the porch that turned out to be a chair with 3 of its legs snapped off. "Okay," he said, slow, taking it in. "Walk me through what happened." She walked him through it, all of it, from the radio intercept to Mercer in the meadow to the 4 men at the cabin. She was precise and specific, and she did not editorialize. She described what she'd seen and heard and documented in the sequence it happened, with times where she had them. Reyes took notes without interrupting her. When she was done, he looked at his notepad for a moment. "The documentation drive," he said. "The photographs, the radio recordings, you have all of that." "In my jacket pocket and uploaded to my attorney's firm server." He looked at her. "In your jacket pocket." "I went back in the workshop for it while they were inside." Reyes stared at her for a long beat. "With 4 of them on the property." 3 at that point. The 4th was on the north side of the building. He stared at her for another moment. Then he looked at his notepad again and wrote something. "Ms. Hale," he said carefully, "what did you do before you came out here?" She looked at him. "I bought a ranch," she said. "I've been here 11 years. He held her gaze. The night was very quiet. The generator was running wrong. She could hear the irregular rhythm of it from the shed. And the wind had died completely. And somewhere out in the dark meadow, a coyote called once and wasn't answered. Reyes wrote something else in his notepad. Then he looked back up at her, and she could see him deciding not to ask the follow-up question. "All right," he said. "Let's go inside and get this documented." She nodded. She went up the porch steps and stepped over the broken chair and opened her cabin door. The lock was intact, the frame had held, and went inside and turned on the kitchen light. The broken window was in the living room. Someone had put their elbow through it, she thought, based on the shape of the break. The room was cold from the draft. Otherwise, it was largely intact. Some drawers pulled out, a shelf knocked over, her kitchen things disturbed but not badly. She stood in the kitchen and looked at it. She thought about the elk calf in October, and the camera thrown in the brush, and the spotlight through her windows, and the 3 trucks in the dark, and 11 months of notes in her green notebook, and the specific thing Mercer had said on that voicemail. "You think you scared me?" She picked up her kettle and filled it at the tap and put it on the burner. Reyes came in behind her, looking around the room. "Ms. Hale," he said, "I think we need to get you some real protection out here." She turned on the burner. "Deputy," she said, "I think we're past the point where I need protecting." Reyes looked at her. Outside, the coyote called again, from farther out this time, and the sound carried across the meadow and up the ridge and into the cold dark of the mountain that she knew, now, as well as she knew anything in her life. The mountain that these men had walked into thinking it was just terrain. The mountain that had been watching them the entire time. Reyes stayed until 2 in the morning. He documented the broken window, the forced generator shed, the scattered firewood, the chair. He photographed everything with a department camera, methodical and thorough, working room by room while Victoria made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and answered his questions when he had them. A second deputy arrived at 11:30. A woman named Fitch, older, quiet, who walked the perimeter with a flashlight and came back with photographs of the ATV tracks in the snow and the specific point on the south fence where Mercer's group had come through. Fresh cut, Fitch said, setting her camera on the table beside her notepad. Wire ends are clean. Tonight. That's a separate fence breach from the pre-existing cuts, Victoria said. The existing cut points are documented in the files I gave to your county attorney's office. Fitch looked at her, then at Reyes. Reyes was looking at the coffee mug in his hands. He'd been quiet for the last hour in the specific way of someone turning something over repeatedly without arriving anywhere comfortable. Ms. Hale, he said finally, I need to ask you something directly. All right. The cameras you have deployed on this property, the radio monitoring, the range markers on the approach trails. Yes, we know about those. Kofor talked to one of our deputies 2 days ago. He set the mug down. That's not standard rancher security. She didn't say anything. The county attorney is going to ask me the same question I'm asking you now, because it's going to come up in any proceeding. Mercer's attorney is going to make it an issue. What's the question? Reyes looked at her directly. Who are you? The kitchen was quiet. The generator was running rough outside. She'd need to look at it in the morning, find out what they'd done to the startup sequence. I'm the owner of this property, she said. I'm the complainant in an active injunction case. I'm a documented victim of criminal trespass, property destruction, and criminal threatening. She looked at him steadily. That's who I am in this proceeding. And before this property, a pause. I was in the Navy, she said. I separated 11 years ago. What rate? That information is in my service record. Reyes held her gaze. He was trying to read her and finding the reading difficult, she could tell. Not because she was being evasive exactly, but because what she was giving him was precisely accurate and precisely incomplete, which was harder to push against than a lie. Okay, he said. He picked up his mug again. Okay. Fitch had been writing in her notepad without looking up. The contempt filing from your attorney's office landed on the county attorney's desk this afternoon, she said. Along with the radio transcript and the basin photographs, he's not happy. With Mercer? With the situation generally? Fitch glanced up. But yes, primarily with Mercer. You've got a guide operation running commercial hunts in violation of a court order, a kill on documented private property, and now a criminal trespass and property destruction incident with 4 identified suspects. She closed the notepad. That's not a gray area anymore. It never was, Victoria said. It just wasn't being treated as one. Fitch nodded once. Not quite an apology. Acknowledgement. They left at 2:15. Victoria stood on the porch and watched the headlights go down the access track and disappear around the first bend. And then she was alone with the generator's unhealthy rhythm and the cold coming in through the broken window she'd covered temporarily with a piece of cardboard and duct tape. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and didn't sleep. She thought about Mercer's final look at the dark before he got on the ATV, the searching quality of it, the recalibration happening in real time behind his eyes. She thought about the question Reyes hadn't quite asked and she hadn't quite answered. She'd been in the Navy, that was true. It was also approximately as descriptive as saying the Blackstone Ridge was approximately hilly. The county attorney's name was Gerald Marsh, and he called her at 8 the next morning. He did not open with pleasantries. Ms. Hale, I've spent the last 2 hours going through the materials your attorney's office sent over, and I want to tell you that what I'm looking at represents the most thoroughly documented trespass case I've seen in 22 years in this office. Thank you. That's not entirely a compliment. Most property owners in your situation call us after the first incident and let us handle it. You ran an independent surveillance operation for 18 months. I filed reports with the sheriff's office repeatedly. Nothing was actioned. A pause. I know, I've seen those reports. His voice shifted slightly. I owe you an apology for that. She hadn't expected that. All right. I'm issuing arrest warrants this morning for Wade Mercer and 3 associates on charges of criminal trespass, property destruction, violation of a court injunction, and criminal threatening. There's also a separate referral to the state game warden's office on the poaching charges. The elk kill in your upper basin is solid, given your photographs and the GPS metadata. A pause. Game warden Hoskins is apparently enthusiastic about that particular referral. He would be. I also want to tell you, and I want you to hear this carefully, that there may be a period of time between the warrant issuance and the arrest where Mercer is aware of his exposure, but not yet in custody. If you have any concern about your personal safety during that window, I'd strongly recommend— I'll be fine, she said. A pause. Miss Hale, 4 men were on your property last night. Yes, and they left when a single deputy arrived. She paused. And before that, they left when asked to by a single woman at a workshop door. The silence on Marsh's end had a particular quality. There's something else, he said. I got a call this morning from a federal contact. I don't want to overstate what was said, but the name Victoria Hale apparently flagged something in a database query. I was asked to let you know that someone would be in touch. He paused again. Do you know what that's about? She looked at the cardboard over her window. I was in the Navy, she said. I expect some records are still active. Marsh waited, clearly hoping she'd say more. She didn't. All right, he said. I'll keep you informed on the warrant process. Your attorney will receive formal notification. Ms. Hale— He stopped himself, started again. I'm sorry it took this long. Just finish it, she said, and hung up. Mercer was arrested at his home in Casper at 11:45 that morning. She knew because Polk called her with the news, and she could hear something in Polk's voice that she recognized as satisfaction, even though Polk was too professional to say so directly. Warrants executed on all 4, Mercer and a man named Durall, were taken at Mercer's residence. The other 2, Briggs and Kofer, surrendered voluntarily through their attorneys. Not Tanner? Tanner isn't named in the property incident. He was one of the 2 who got disoriented on the North Ridge earlier in the week. His involvement is on the poaching side, which is Hoskins' jurisdiction. Victoria sat with that. Tanner, who'd come back to camp and stared at the fire and said, "Fine." I'm fine in the voice of someone who was not fine. Mercer's attorney filed for immediate bond, Polk continued, which will likely be granted. He's not a flight risk by standard metrics. Business owner, property in state, no priors beyond the civil matter. So he'll be out today, probably by 4 o'clock. What's his exposure? On the current charges, criminal trespass is a misdemeanor in Wyoming. Property destruction depends on valuation. Your window and the generator damage might push it, but it's borderline. The contempt charge is the most significant because it's a court matter rather than a criminal matter, and judges take a dim view. Polk paused. The poaching charge carries the real weight. Commercial guide operating in violation of state game law, illegal take on documented private property that goes after his guide license. If Hoskins builds a full case, Mercer could lose his ability to operate commercially in Wyoming permanently. That's what matters to him, Victoria said, more than a fine. I know. There was a pause between them. Victoria, Polk said. Marsh told me he got a federal flag on your name. Yes. Do you want to tell me anything before someone shows up at your door? Victoria looked at the kitchen, the coffee going cold on the table, the cardboard window, the broken chair on the porch. She still hadn't moved. No, she said. Not right now. Polk accepted that with the equanimity of a woman who'd been practicing law for 30 years. All right, I'll be in touch when Mercer's bond status is confirmed. The federal contact arrived the following afternoon. She'd been repairing the window frame all morning. New glass cut from a sheet she drove to pick up in Prentice, reglazed and sealed by noon. And she was putting her tools away in the workshop when a dark blue government-issue SUV came up the access track. Civilian plates, but the vehicle had the specific featureless quality of federal procurement, and the 2 people who got out wore the specific unremarkable clothes of people trying to look like they weren't anything in particular. One was a woman in her early 50s, trim, gray-haired, carrying a leather portfolio. The other was a man about the same age, heavier, moving with a slight hitch in his right knee that he'd trained himself not to favor but couldn't entirely hide. Victoria watched them from the workshop door. The woman saw her first and raised a hand. Not a wave, more of an acknowledgement. She walked toward the workshop and the man followed. Miss Hale, the woman said. I'm Agent Darrow, DHS. This is Agent Calloway. DHS, Victoria said. We're not here about your current situation. We're aware of it, and we understand it's being handled at the county level. Then what are you here about? Darrow looked at her carefully. We'd like to talk inside if that's okay. Victoria looked at them both for a moment, at Darrow's portfolio and Calloway's knee and the way they were standing. Not aggressive, not casual, somewhere in between that she recognized. "All right," she said. They sat at her kitchen table. She offered coffee and Darrow accepted and Calloway declined, and she poured 2 mugs and sat down and waited. Darrow opened the portfolio and laid a single sheet on the table, not toward Victoria. Between them, neutral space. Victoria looked at it. A photograph. Aerial, high resolution, mountain terrain she didn't immediately recognize. Something circled in red marker. 3 weeks ago, Darrow said, a federal monitoring operation in the Bridger-Teton National Forest identified what we believe to be a clandestine staging area for a wildlife trafficking network. Animal parts, primarily high-value elk antler velvet, bear gall, mountain lion pelts. Interstate trafficking with ties to distribution networks in 3 states. She paused. The operation has been active for approximately 2 years. We've had difficulty establishing a surveillance foothold because the terrain is complex, and the principals are experienced outdoorsmen who vary their routes and timing. Victoria looked at the photograph. "What does this have to do with me?" she said. 14 months ago, a man named Wade Mercer made 3 documented trips into the Bridger-Teton that align with this network's identified activity pattern. Darrow paused. "We weren't aware of the connection until your documentation, specifically the camera footage and the radio transcripts, was filed with the county attorney's office 2 days ago. One of our analysts saw Mercer's name in the filing and cross-referenced." The kitchen was very quiet. "You're saying Mercer isn't just running commercial hunts on my property," Victoria said slowly. "We're saying Mercer outfitters may have been using your property as a route corridor for a larger commercial poaching and trafficking operation. Your terrain provides access to the northern Bridger-Teton without going through any monitored entry points." Darrow's voice was measured. "Your documentation of his access patterns over 18 months is frankly better surveillance product than anything our operation has generated." Victoria looked at the photograph on the table. She thought about the elk calf in October, about the gut piles and the shell casings, and the 3-day camp in her timber, about the fact that Mercer's people had come back month after month, varying their routes and timing with the discipline she'd attributed to arrogance, but that looked different now. "What do you want?" she said. Calloway spoke for the first time. His voice was flat and direct. "We want access to your documentation archive. Everything. The camera footage, the GPS logs, the radio recordings, the timeline you built in your notebooks. We want to go through it with our analysts and identify anything that connects to the Bridger-Teton network." "You could subpoena that." "We could," he said. "We'd rather not. Subpoenas create records and timelines, and the principals sometimes find out before we're ready for them to." She looked at him. "You want me to give it to you voluntarily and quietly?" "We want to work with you," Darrow said. "Not around you." Victoria picked up her coffee. She looked at the aerial photograph on the table. She thought about 18 months of early mornings and fence repairs and 3-hour drives to file reports that went nowhere. "I want Polk present for any formal arrangement," she said. "My attorney." "That's reasonable." "I want the Mercer case county charges to proceed independently. Whatever you're building federally doesn't affect what happens to him for what he did to my property." "We have no interest in interfering with county prosecution," Darrow said. "I want that in writing." Darrow looked at her for a moment, then she nodded. "We can do that. And I want to know how you flagged my name." Victoria looked at Darrow directly. "Marsh said DHS flagged the name Victoria Hale. I've been Victoria Hale for 11 years. That name isn't in any federal database that should be active." The 2 agents exchanged a look. Calloway put his hands flat on the table. "The flag is legacy," he said carefully, "from a joint task force that was decommissioned in 2019. When your name came up in the county filing, it hit an archived cross-reference that probably should have been cleared when the task force stood down." He paused. "It wasn't." "What task force?" A pause. "Maritime Interdiction Coordination," Calloway said. 2008 to 2014. Victoria looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who knew he'd said enough and was waiting to see if she'd confirm it. She said nothing. "The point is," Darrow said, moving forward, "the flag tells us you're someone who understands how these operations work, which is part of why we'd rather work with you than around you." Victoria set her mug down. She sat with it for a moment. The specific discomfort of a life she'd deliberately closed being referenced at her kitchen table by two people with federal credentials and careful eyes. She'd chosen this ranch partly because Wyoming was not on the list of places that had mattered before. Not a port, not a coast, not a transit corridor. A mountain. Quiet. No one's operational concern. "I'll call Polk," she said. "We can meet tomorrow." Polk arrived at 9 the next morning and spent 45 minutes with the two agents before Victoria joined them. She could hear the conversation through the workshop wall without being able to make out words. Polk's measured cadence, Darrow's responses, the occasional flat interjection from Calloway. The rhythm of competent people establishing terms. When Victoria came in, Polk had 2 pages of handwritten notes and looked satisfied in the carefully neutral way she looked when things were proceeding well, but she didn't want to project overconfidence. "We have a framework," Polk said. "DHS gets access to the documentation archive in a format we control. No originals leave this property. The county prosecution is firewalled from any federal investigation development. Any federal action derived from your documentation credits you as a cooperating witness, which has implications for any civil recovery in the trespass matter." She paused. "That last part is new. It gives you standing to pursue civil damages against Mercer Outfitters if the federal case develops as they believe it will." "What are they expecting to find in the documentation?" Victoria asked. Darrow answered, "Evidence of the trafficking network's route planning through your property. Communication intercepts we can cross-reference with our existing intercepts. Possibly, and this is tentative, identification of a principal in the network we haven't been able to tie to Mercer through our own surveillance." Victoria thought about the radio traffic, the frequency discipline that had shifted in the last week, the code language she hadn't had a key for. "I have 6 weeks of recorded radio traffic from Mercer's camp channel," she said. "Early in the operation, the communication was routine. In the last 10 days it changed. Shorter transmissions, coded references I couldn't decode." Calloway leaned forward slightly. "Changed how?" "Different operational security posture. They became aware they had an observer on the ground and tightened their protocol." She paused. "But the first 4 weeks is open traffic, unguarded." Darrow and Calloway looked at each other. 4 weeks of open traffic for Mercer's operation would be... Darrow stopped herself, recalibrated. "That would be very useful." "It's all on the drive," Victoria said. "Date stamped, labeled by recording session." Another look between the agents. Calloway said, "The documentation you built, the system you used, the camera placement, the radio monitoring, the topographic notation." He stopped. "That's not..." He looked for the right word. "Civilian methodology," Darrow finished. Victoria looked at her. "I was in the Navy." "For how long?" "Long enough." Calloway's knee was bothering him. She could tell by the way he'd shifted his weight twice in the last few minutes. "Old injury, wrong chair height." "Maritime interdiction," he said. "That task force, it wasn't a desk operation." She picked up her coffee. "No," she said, "it wasn't." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Polk, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone filing everything away, said simply, "My client's service record is not relevant to the current proceeding." "No," Darrow agreed quickly. "It isn't." She looked at Victoria. "What's relevant is what you built here, and that you were willing to build it and maintain it under the kind of pressure Mercer was generating." A pause. "A lot of people would have sold the property." "People suggested that." "What made you stay?" Victoria looked at the window she'd reglazed yesterday. The new glass slightly cleaner than the old frame around it, the seal still pale where it hadn't cured. "It's my land," she said. Came out simple, not defiant, just factual. "I chose it. I built something here." She looked back at Darrow. "Nobody gets to take that from me because they're louder." The room was quiet. Polk closed her notepad. "Shall we talk about the formal documentation transfer protocol?" Sheriff Ethan Cole came out to the property that afternoon. She hadn't met him before. The interactions had always been at the deputy level. Cortez, then Fitch, then Reyes. Cole had apparently decided, given the federal involvement now becoming known at the county level, that the property and its owner warranted his personal attention. He was in his early 60s, heavy-set, with the careful eyes of someone who'd been doing a political job for a long time, without becoming entirely political. He parked his vehicle and walked to the porch without hurrying and stood there until she came out. "Miss Hale, Sheriff Cole." "I know who you are." He nodded, not embarrassed, acknowledging. "I expect you've got some feelings about the response time on your prior reports." "I have documentation of 11 reports over 18 months. "I know, I read all of them this morning." He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "I'm not here to tell you the system worked, because it didn't. I'm here to tell you it's working now, and to ask if there's anything my office can do to make sure you're secure while Mercer's bond is active." She looked at him. She'd expected defensiveness or bureaucratic smoothing and was slightly recalibrating at the absence of it. "Increased patrol presence on the county road would help," she said. "The access track is private, but if there's a visible patrol presence at the gate junction, it serves as a deterrent." "I can do that." He paused. "What else?" "I'd like Cortez to have a direct line to my number, not the dispatch queue." Cole nodded. "Done." He looked at her for a moment. "The federal people. They came to see you. Yesterday. They brief you on what they think Mercer's been running?" "They gave me enough context." He looked out at the meadow. "I've been sheriff in this county for 14 years. I knew Mercer by reputation, guide operation, some prior complaints, nothing that rose to criminal. I didn't know—" He stopped. "I should have looked harder." "Yes," she said. Not unkindly, but not softening it either. He accepted that. "The game warden Hoskins says you've been tracking elk population on this property for years. Detailed logs. Since my second year, he says the herd data you have is more thorough than anything his office maintains for this drainage. His office is understaffed and covers 4 counties. Cole almost smiled at that. Almost. "Yes, it is." He looked back at her. "DHS told the county attorney this morning that the Mercer operation may be the largest commercial wildlife trafficking case in Wyoming in the last decade." He paused. "And that the documentation that cracked it was built by one woman on 900 acres. She didn't say anything. I just—" He stopped again. Started differently. "What you did up here. What you were doing on that mountain for 6 days while Mercer's people were in the field. I've got deputies with field training who wouldn't have managed it." He looked at her. "Who were you, before the ranch?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I was someone who did a job," she said, "and then I stopped." He waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "All right," he said, in the way people said all right when they understood they'd reached the edge of what someone was going to tell them. "I'll have Cortez's direct number texted to you within the hour." He went back to his vehicle. She watched him go. She stood on the porch in the cold for a while after he left, looking at the meadow. The snow was cleaner than it had been. Wind had smoothed the ATV tracks somewhat, softened the edges. In another day or two, they'd be gone entirely. She thought about the question he'd asked and the one Reyes had asked and the one Calloway had moved around. The same question, coming from different angles. The question of who she was before. She'd been a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. That part was easy. Separating, November 2013, after 15 years that looked one way on paper and were another way entirely in the operational record that nobody but a small number of people with the right clearances could access. She'd run surveillance and interdiction operations in maritime corridors from the Strait of Malacca to the Gulf of Aden to the Eastern Mediterranean. She'd operated in environments where the objective was not to be seen, where the methodology was patience and information and the careful accumulation of advantage, where violence was a last resort and psychological terrain was the primary battlefield. She'd been extraordinarily good at it. She'd also been exhausted by it in a way that didn't show on paper and couldn't be addressed within the structure she was operating in. Because what she was exhausted by was not the operations themselves, but the institutional mathematics of it. The way the decisions made at levels above her converted her work and the work of people she trusted into outcomes that didn't always justify the cost. So she'd stopped. She'd found a piece of land at the edge of nowhere, and she'd built something quiet, and she'd tried very hard to be simply a woman on a ranch in Wyoming who kept to herself and didn't impose on anyone and asked only the same in return. She'd been largely successful for a long time. And then 5 armed men had cut through her fence and laughed. She went back inside. Polk had left an hour ago, and the agents were gone, and the cabin was quiet. She sat at the kitchen table and opened a new green notebook. She'd bought a dozen at a time, kept them in the workshop cabinet, and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Then she wrote, "Documentation archived. County prosecution active. Federal referral active. Property secure." She looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then, below it, she wrote, "Window repaired. Generator service needed." She closed the notebook. She put water on for coffee and went to the workshop to look at the generator. The startup sequence had been run wrong twice. She could tell by the condition of the spark plug, which showed carbon fouling consistent with a too rich fuel mix at ignition. Not catastrophic. Fixable. She pulled the plug, cleaned it, reset the gap, reinstalled it, and ran the generator through the correct sequence. It evened out within 30 seconds, running smooth and steady. She stood and listened to it run correctly and felt something unknot slightly in her chest. Her phone rang. Polk. "Mercer posted bond at 4:15. He's out." "All right." His attorney has filed a motion to dismiss the contempt charge on procedural grounds. Unlikely to succeed, but it's standard practice. A pause. "He also filed a counter-complaint against you for harassment." She looked at the generator. "On what basis?" "The radio monitoring. His attorney is arguing that recording his camp communications constituted illegal wiretapping. His camp was operating on an open, unencrypted radio frequency accessible to anyone with a scanner. There's no reasonable expectation of privacy." "I know, the motion will be dismissed, but it tells us something about his strategy. He's going to try to make the proceeding about you rather than about him." "Let him try." "Victoria," Polk's voice shifted. "Marsh got a call from Mercer's attorney this afternoon. They're floating a settlement. Mercer agrees to a 2-year suspension of his Wyoming guide license, pays your documented property damages, and all criminal charges are dropped." Victoria looked at the generator. "No," she said. "I told Marsh you'd say that. He agrees with you, for the record, but I'm required to convey any settlement communication." "I know." "The criminal charges proceed." "The criminal charges proceed," Victoria said, "and the federal referral proceeds, and the game warden's case proceeds." She paused. "He doesn't get to buy his way out of this." Polk was quiet for a moment. "I'll let Marsh know." She hung up and stood in the workshop for a while, listening to the generator run clean. Outside, the evening was coming down fast. The sky had gone the color of old iron above the ridge, and the light on the snow had shifted from white to blue-gray. The mountain was going quiet in the way it went quiet at dusk, the birds settling, the wind dropping, the timber standing dark against the pale sky. She'd been out here 6 days. 6 days of cold and no sleep and bad food, and the particular focused attention that left you hollowed out in a way that wasn't quite fatigue and wasn't quite calm, but something between the two. She was tired, actually tired, in the bones. She went inside and made herself eat, real food this time, pasta on the stove, actual effort, and she sat at the table and ate it slowly and looked out the repaired window at the darkening meadow. She thought about the elk group in the upper basin, 6 animals now instead of 7. She'd need to update her population log in the spring. She thought about Voss, who'd been in the contempt filing by name and had surrendered voluntarily through an attorney. She wondered if he'd managed to find the exit yet. She thought about Cody Braddock, 19 or 20, holding his rifle in the tent with the careful self-consciousness of someone trying to be what his father assumed he was. She finished her food. She washed the plate. She went to the back bedroom and moved the bed and lifted the floor panel. She opened the polymer case and looked at what was inside. The topographic maps were still out on the kitchen table, Lada. She hadn't put them back. The radio unit was on the workshop shelf. The monocular was in her pack. What remained in the case was what had always remained there. The history of a different version of herself, packed in foam with the care of long habit. She looked at it for a while. Then she reached in and took out the sealed waterproof bag she hadn't opened since the first night. Inside was a set of documents in a clear sleeve. Official, dense, multiple pages. And beneath those, something smaller. She took out the smaller thing, a military decoration. Not large. A ribbon bar in specific colors she knew without needing to look at the citation beneath it. A citation that described actions and dates and coordinates in language that was accurate and almost entirely bloodless. The way official language always managed to be accurate and almost entirely bloodless about the things that actually happened. She held it in her palm. She hadn't looked at it in 4 years. She sat on the floor of her bedroom with the decoration in her hand and the open case beside her and the sound of the generator running properly in the background. And she didn't think about anything in particular for a while. Just sat. Her knee was bothering her, cold weather, an old ligament issue that had never fully resolved. And she shifted position and the knee protested and she shifted again and it was only moderately better. Imperfect, tired, sitting on the floor. She thought about what Darrow had said. A lot of people would have sold the property. She looked at the decoration in her palm. It wasn't that she couldn't have left. She could have. She'd had the exit available for the entire 18 months, had thought about it sometimes in the early hours of hard nights, what it would cost to just sell, start somewhere else, find another piece of land further from anyone's interest. She could have left. She just wasn't built for leaving. She put the decoration back in the waterproof bag, put the bag back in the case, closed and locked it. She stood up, knee complaining, and moved the bed back into position. Tomorrow she would call Marsh. She would review Polk's documentation of the federal arrangement. She would assess the generator more thoroughly and probably need to replace the fuel filter. She would start the process of replacing the 6 destroyed cameras on the western perimeter with units that would be harder to find and harder to reach. Tomorrow was a long list of things. Tonight she went to bed at 8:30 with the generator running clean outside and the repaired window holding against the cold, and she slept without dreaming for the first time in a week. And on the mountain above her cabin, in the dark and the cold and the absolute silence of the high country in November, nothing moved that she hadn't already accounted for. She woke at 5:15 without the alarm. Old habit, the body holding its own schedule regardless of what the mind intended. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening. Generator quiet, wind quiet, the particular heavy silence of a mountain after snowfall. At some point in the night, it had snowed again. She could tell by the quality of the dark outside the window, the way snowlight reflected up even before dawn. She got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window and watched the gray come in slowly over the eastern ridge, the light building in increments. The meadow emerging from the dark as a white field unmarked by anything. Clean, new. Whatever the last weeks had pressed into this ground temporarily smoothed over. She drank her coffee and didn't feel any particular way about it, just looked. Then she put on her jacket and went out and fed the animals. 2 horses she kept in the lower paddock, a practical pair she used for fence work and terrain the truck couldn't reach. They were restless from the confinement of the last week, moving in tight circles when she came in with hay, pushing at each other with their shoulders. She gave them extra grain and stood with them for a while in the cold barn smell of hay and manure and horse sweat until they settled. She went back to the cabin and started a list. The preliminary hearing was set for the 2nd week of December, 3 weeks out. In the meantime, the machinery of consequence moved with the slow grinding efficiency of institutions doing what they were built to do, which was, eventually, imperfectly, with significant friction, resolve things. Hoskins filed formal poaching charges against Mercer, Tanner, and 2 clients whose names appeared in the documented radio traffic in connection with the elk kill in her upper basin. The guide license suspension proceeding opened separately through the Wyoming State Board of Outfitters and Professional Guides, which moved faster than the criminal case and had lower evidentiary standards. Polk submitted Victoria's documentation directly to the board and received a confirmation of receipt within 48 hours. The federal piece moved quietly, the way federal things moved. No announcements, no press, just Darrow checking in twice a week by phone with brief, precise updates. The radio transcripts from the first 4 weeks of Mercer's camp operation had yielded, according to Darrow, a significant piece of the trafficking network's communication pattern. There were names in it, routes, timing. "We're not at a point where I can tell you specifics," Darrow said on a Thursday morning, the 2nd week of November. "But I can tell you that what you built here is going to matter beyond your property line." "How far beyond?" 3 states, potentially. A pause. "Maybe more." Victoria was in the workshop working on the new camera installation plan, upgraded units, repositioned at heights and angles that would be harder to reach and harder to identify. She had a schematic spread on the workbench and a cup of coffee going cold near the door. "Darrow," she said, "the principal's in the network, above Mercer. We're working on that. Will Mercer cooperate?" A pause. His attorney has made initial contact with our office, so possibly. She looked at her schematic. If he cooperates, what happens to the county charges? That's a conversation between our office, the county attorney, and the court. We don't control county prosecution. Another pause. But Marsh has been clear that he intends to see the criminal trespass and property destruction charges through regardless of any federal arrangement. Good, she said. After she hung up, she stood at the workbench for a while, looking at the camera schematic. She thought about what cooperation meant for Mercer, the arithmetic of it, what he had to trade against, what he stood to lose. The guide license was already effectively gone. Hoskins had been explicit with Polk that the board suspension would proceed regardless of the criminal case outcome, and given the documented pattern, 2 years of commercial operations, multiple violations, an active court injunction ignored, the suspension would likely be permanent. 25 years. That was what the website had said. 25 years of Wyoming backcountry experience. All of it built on the assumption that the rules that applied to other people didn't quite apply to him. She picked up her pencil and went back to the schematic. Garrett Voss called her on a Tuesday morning. She almost didn't answer. Unknown number, local area code, and she'd been fielding enough unknown numbers in the last 2 weeks that she'd developed a habit of letting them go to voicemail first. But something made her pick up. Ms. Hale. His voice was tight. This is Garrett Voss. I'm not sure why I'm calling you. She stood at the kitchen window. The horses were in the paddock, moving along the fence line in the thin morning sun. All right, she said. A pause. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened on your property. All of it. Another pause. I knew what we were doing was wrong. I told myself it was gray area, but I knew. She waited. I've got a family, he said. I said that in camp like it was a reason to be careful, and I don't know, maybe I used it as an excuse not to. Look, I'm not trying to... He stopped. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to say it. She looked at the horses. The elk in my upper basin, she said. The bull you took with Braddock, 5.5 years old. I'd been logging that animal for 2 seasons. Silence on the line. I know that doesn't mean anything to you, she said, but I wanted you to know it meant something. It does mean something, Voss said, quietly. I'm sorry. She stood at the window for another moment. You should talk to a lawyer, she said, before the hearing, if you haven't already. I have. All right. She hung up and looked at the horses for a while. She didn't feel good about the conversation or bad about it. It was what it was. A man who'd known better and done it anyway, finally saying so, which was worth approximately as much as that and no more. But she'd meant what she said about the elk. The hearing was a Tuesday in December, cold and clear, the kind of Wyoming winter day that was bright enough to hurt your eyes and cold enough to hurt everything else. She drove to Ridgecrest with Polk, who spent the first half of the drive reviewing procedural notes and the second half in comfortable silence, which was something Victoria appreciated about her. She didn't fill silence with noise just to manage her own discomfort. The county courthouse was a 2-story building on the main street with a Wyoming flag and an American flag in front, and a parking lot that was half full by 9 in the morning. Victoria had been here before, so the filing visits, the early report attempts that went nowhere, but it felt different today. She couldn't entirely say why. The building was the same building. She thought it might have something to do with the fact that she was walking in as the person who had built the case rather than the person asking the system to see a problem. Mercer was already there when they arrived, sitting with his attorney, a firm-looking man named Casper, on a bench in the corridor outside the courtroom. He was dressed in a jacket and tie that looked like they'd been put on with some effort, and his hair was different than it had been on the mountain, neater, managed. He looked like a businessman, which she supposed was the point. He saw her when she came through the door. He held her gaze for a moment, not aggressively, not the way he'd looked from the camp or held the spotlight on her windows. Something else. She couldn't entirely read it and didn't spend much time trying. She looked away and followed Polk to the other side of the corridor. Don't engage, Polk said quietly. I know. I mean it. If he says anything... Sandra, she said. I know. Polk looked at her, then nodded and went back to her notes. Mercer didn't say anything. The hearing ran 4 hours with a break at midday. Judge Patricia Summer was 60, precise, and clearly had read every document in the case file before walking into the courtroom, which was evident from the specificity of her questions and the short patience she showed when Casper tried to introduce procedural arguments she'd already considered and rejected in her own preliminary review. The contempt charge was the first matter. Casper's motion to dismiss on wiretapping grounds was addressed in the first 30 minutes. Summer was not impressed. Counsel, your client's camp was transmitting on an open, unencrypted radio frequency available to any receiver within range. There is no statutory or common law expectation of privacy in a broadcast transmission of this nature. She looked at Casper over her reading glasses. Motion denied. We're moving on. Casper moved on. Victoria sat at the complainant's table and listened while Polk walked the court through the documentation. It took 2 hours. The camera footage logs, the GPS evidence, the timeline of incidents, the radio transcripts, the incident records from the sheriff's office. Summer asked precise questions throughout. She occasionally looked at Victoria directly, and Victoria met her eyes and answered when addressed and otherwise stayed still. The criminal trespass and property destruction charges were straightforward once the documentation was in. Casper attempted to introduce the argument that Victoria's surveillance operation had constituted provocation, a line of argument that Summer let him develop for approximately 4 minutes before she stopped him. Counsel. Your client received written legal notice in October, received a formal injunction filing in November, and received certified correspondence from Ms. Hale's attorney on 3 separate occasions. The response to that legal notice was to escalate the trespass activity, destroy surveillance equipment, make recorded criminal threats, and ultimately dispatch 4 individuals to the complainant's property who caused physical damage and made explicit statements about retaliation. She set down the page she'd been holding. I'm going to need a more substantial foundation before I find that provocative. Casper tried. He didn't find the foundation. At 2 in the afternoon, with the winter light coming flat through the courtroom's tall windows, Summer delivered her findings. Criminal contempt of court, sustained, fine of $8,000, and a mandatory compliance review period of 18 months. Any further violations would trigger automatic custodial consideration. Criminal trespass. Guilty finding on 4 counts, including the separate counts related to Mercer personally. Fines totaling $6,000, 2 years probation, mandatory stay away from Victoria Hale's property, and a 1-mile perimeter. Property destruction, guilty. Restitution to cover documented damage. The cameras, the generator repair, the window, the chair, the fence cuts going back to documented instances. Polk had put that number together carefully, and it came to $11,340. The criminal threatening charge, the voicemail, the text message, the statements made outside the cabin, resulted in a finding that Summer said she would be referring to the county attorney for separate prosecution consideration, as the recorded evidence met the statutory threshold for a standalone charge. Casper was on his feet. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Casper. I have read every document in this file. Your client was served with a court order, violated it within 72 hours, continued to violate it over a period of 3 weeks, and then personally led a group of individuals onto the complainant's property in the hours after becoming aware of his contempt exposure. She looked at Mercer. I would like to be very clear, Mr. Mercer, that the conduct documented in this case is not a gray area. It is not a question of disputed survey lines or unclear property boundaries. It is a pattern of deliberate harassment that escalated into criminal conduct against a person who did nothing but assert her legal rights. A pause. I hope the record of this proceeding follows you. The room was quiet. Mercer's jaw was set, and his hands were flat on the table in front of him, and he was looking at the surface of that table with the expression of a man receiving something he couldn't quite process yet. Victoria looked at him for a moment. She felt nothing in particular. Not vindicated, not satisfied. It was more like the feeling of something finally balanced, an account that had been running wrong for a long time, corrected. She looked away. Polk leaned in and said quietly, "The board notice came through while we were in session. Guide license suspension, permanent, effective immediately." Victoria nodded, 25 years. They walked out of the courthouse into the cold afternoon. The sun was low and bright, hitting the snow on the courthouse steps at an angle that made everything white and sharp-edged. Polk stood beside her on the steps and exhaled. That went well. she said, in the way she said things when they'd gone better than she'd let herself expect. Yes, Victoria said. The criminal threatening referral is significant. If Marsh pursues it, Mercer is looking at a third criminal matter on top of the federal exposure. Polk paused. He's going to cooperate with DHS. His attorney would be negligent if he didn't recommend it. I know. The restitution order goes to collections if he doesn't pay within 30 days. Given his current exposure across 3 proceedings, he may be looking at liquidating the business anyway. She paused. The Mercer Outfitters operation is effectively done. Victoria looked at the street. A few people moved along the sidewalk, going about their Tuesday afternoon. A woman with a stroller, a man loading something into a truck. Ordinary life in a small county seat in Wyoming. Sandra, she said. Thank you. Polk was quiet for a moment. In the time they'd worked together, Victoria had noticed that Polk was not a person who was easily surprised, but something moved across her expression now. Not surprise exactly. Something smaller than that. The recognition of being seen. You did the work, Polk said. You knew how to use it. They stood on the steps for another moment. Then Polk said she needed to get back to the office, and they shook hands and Polk got in her car and drove, and Victoria stood alone on the courthouse steps for a while, looking at nothing in particular. Reyes found her before she reached the parking lot. He was off duty, civilian jacket, no uniform, and he had the slightly awkward posture of someone approaching a person in a context where he wasn't sure what the protocol was. Ms. Hale, deputy. Just Reyes. He stopped a few feet from her. I wasn't in there, but I heard it went okay. It went fine. He nodded. He seemed to be building to something. I asked around, he said, after the night at your property, about your service record. He paused. I've got a contact at JAG, Judge Advocate's office, who I played ball with in college. I called in a favor. She looked at him. He couldn't tell me the classified parts, Reyes said. There was a lot he couldn't tell me. He paused again. But he told me enough. She waited. I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for how long it took us to take this seriously. He said it simply, not as a performance. And I wanted to tell you that what you did, up on that mountain, alone for 6 days, I've got guys on my team with field training, and I'm not sure any of them could have done what you did. And I wanted you to know that somebody knows that. She looked at him for a moment. His face was sincere in the specific, uncomfortable way of men who weren't used to saying things like this, and were saying them anyway. Thank you, she said. You need anything from my office going forward? I have your direct number. Yeah. He put his hands in his pockets. Yeah, you do. He nodded once. Take care of yourself, Ms. Hale. You too, Reyes. He walked away. She stood in the parking lot for a moment. The sun was getting lower, the shadows longer, the cold deepening toward the kind of evening temperature that meant another frozen night on the ridge. She got in her truck and drove home. The drive back was 3 hours and she didn't listen to the radio. She watched the landscape change as she left the county seat. Buildings giving way to ranches, ranches giving way to open country lifting gradually toward the foothills, and then the foothills rising into the proper mountains, snow-covered and enormous in the late afternoon light. She'd driven this road so many times that she didn't see it anymore as a rule, just drove it. But today, she saw it. The way the light hit the aspens, bare now in December, their white trunks violet in the shadow. The long valley opening to the west with the mountains behind it. The particular geography of a place that had taken years to become hers. She thought about what Darrow had said. 3 states, potentially. She thought about 18 months of green notebooks. She thought about Voss's voice on the phone. I knew what we were doing was wrong. She thought about Cody Braddock, 19 years old, holding his rifle in the tent. She hoped he'd found his own exit from whatever his father had decided he needed to be. She turned onto the county road and then onto the access track and drove the 4 miles up through the switchbacks with the headlights on, the dark coming down fast, the snow on the track packed and manageable. She parked beside the cabin and sat for a moment with the engine running and the heater on. Then she turned it off and went inside. 3 weeks later, on a cold night with snow coming down steady, Hoskins called. We got the federal indictment, he said. He sounded like a man who'd been holding something in his chest for a long time, and had just been allowed to put it down. 7 individuals, 3 states. Wildlife trafficking, conspiracy, money laundering. Mercer is named as a material cooperating witness. Cooperating, she said. Full cooperation in exchange for reduced exposure on the federal charges. County charges stand. The contempt finding, the trespass, the property destruction. He's still paying restitution, and he's still on probation. A pause. And he's still permanently banned from holding a guide license in Wyoming. She stood at the kitchen window. Outside, the snow was coming down in thick, slow flakes, the kind that came straight down without wind, piling on every surface. 7 people, she said. It's a significant network. Been operating for 4 years. Hoskins' voice had something in it she recognized as the specific satisfaction of a man who believed in his work. $17,000 in documented illegal wildlife product. Elk velvet, bear gall, trophy skulls, running it through a distribution network to buyers in 3 states. A pause. They wouldn't have found it without what you built. She thought about the gut piles, about the elk calf in October and the bull in November, and the months of population logs in her green notebooks. Hoskins, she said, what happens to the Blackstone Ridge herd from here? Without the pressure from Mercer's operations, they should recover naturally. The disruption to the migration pattern should clear up in a season or 2. He paused. I'd like to formally incorporate your population logs into our monitoring program for this drainage. If you're willing, it's the best longitudinal data on that herd that exists. She looked out at the snow. Send me the paperwork, she said. After she hung up, she stood at the window for a long time. 7 people indicted. A trafficking network dismantled. 18 months of green notebooks that had started as a way to protect her fence line and ended as federal evidence in a multi-state prosecution. Her knee ached from the cold. The generator was running clean. The new cameras were installed on the western perimeter. Better units, better positions, harder to reach. She went to the workshop and got the polymer case and brought it to the kitchen table. She opened it and looked at everything inside for a while. The maps were already put back, refolded, and returned to their slot in the foam. The radio unit. The monocular. The sealed waterproof bag. She took the bag out. She took the decoration out of the bag. She turned it over in her hand once. Didn't look at the citation. She knew what it said. She got up from the table and went to the fireplace. She'd had a fire going all evening. Nothing elaborate, just a practical fire for warmth. She stood in front of it with the decoration in her hand. She wasn't going to burn it. That wasn't the thought. The thought was something harder to put into words. About what you kept and why. About the difference between burying something and simply setting it down. About the fact that what she'd done on this mountain in November had come from the same place as everything in that case, and she was done pretending otherwise. She moved the small framed photograph that had sat above the fireplace for 2 years, a landscape shot she'd taken of the upper meadow in summer, and set the decoration on the mantel in its place. Then she stepped back and looked at it. It was small. The firelight caught the edge of the ribbon bar. It didn't look like much from a distance, just a small piece of metal and cloth that an institution had used to note something it mostly kept quiet about. But she knew what it meant, and she was done keeping that quiet from herself. She sat down in the chair by the fire. Outside, the snow kept coming, the slow, steady kind that accumulated without asking permission, that covered everything in the same patient, unannounced way she'd covered ground for 6 days in November. She thought about something her training officer had told her a long time ago, in a different mountain range on a different continent at the end of a very long week. He'd said, "The field doesn't care what you are. It only cares what you do." She'd carried that for 20 years. It was still true. In January, the feed store in Ridgecrest got a new shipment, and she drove in to pick up a bulk order of oats and a replacement fence post driver and some miscellaneous hardware. The man behind the counter, she'd been buying from him for 9 years and knew his name was Daryl, rang her up without much conversation, which was the ordinary mode of their interaction. But when she picked up the bags to carry them out, he said, "Ms. Hale." She stopped. "I heard about what happened out on your property," he said, "with those hunters." He had the careful expression of a man choosing his words. "I'm sorry it took so long for somebody to do something about it." She looked at him. "Thank you, Daryl," she said. She carried her bags out to the truck. The parking lot was cold and mostly empty, one other truck and a car with its engine running. The mountains were visible from here on a clear day. She could see the top of the Blackstone Ridge from this exact spot, a pale white line against the blue winter sky. She loaded the oats and the hardware and got in and sat for a moment. The word had moved, the way it moved in small counties, through the diners and the hardware stores and the ranch supply operations, the unofficial network of people who knew each other's business because they'd been sharing the same roads and the same weather and the same difficult winters for generations. What happened on Blackstone Ridge? What a quiet woman alone out there had done and what it had turned into. She'd heard fragments of it already. Hoskins had mentioned something. Reyes had alluded to it. Polk had gotten a call from a reporter at the Casper paper that she'd deflected. Victoria hadn't talked to anyone and wasn't going to. That wasn't the kind of recognition she wanted. What she wanted was the thing she'd come here for 11 years ago and finally had again. She started the truck. She drove back up into the mountains. On a clear afternoon in late January, she rode the east fence line on horseback, the first real ride since the November work had started. The horse, a gray quarter horse she'd bought as a 4-year-old and was now 11, solid and practical and opinionated about pace, moved with the easy authority of an animal that knew the terrain and was glad to be in it. The fence line was intact. The new cameras were in place. The snow was deep in the timber but manageable on the open ground. And the air had a quality that was purely itself, cold and clean and empty of anything that wasn't the mountain. She rode the north section and stopped on the ridge above the upper meadow. Below her, in the meadow, the satellite elk group was feeding in the thin afternoon light. She counted them from horseback. 6 animals, same as before. Same 3 cows, same remaining bulls. They'd wintered here, the way they always did, on this meadow that she'd been cataloging since her 2nd year on the property. She sat on the horse and watched them for a while. One of the bulls lifted his head and looked in her direction. She stayed still. He looked for a long moment, ears forward, testing the air. Then he went back to feeding. She stayed until the light shifted and the cold deepened and the elk began moving toward the northern timber for the evening. Then she turned the horse and rode home. She cooked dinner properly that night for the first time in weeks, something that required actual attention, a pot of chili with dried beans and smoked meat and onions and peppers, the kind of thing that took a couple of hours and filled the cabin with warmth. She ate at the kitchen table. She opened her green notebook, a new one, barely started, and wrote the date. Below it she wrote, Elk Group, 6 animals present, Upper Meadow, East Sector, 2 bulls showing good winter body condition. Migration pattern appears stable. She sat for a while after she'd written that. Then she wrote one more line below the elk observation, in the same practical handwriting she used for fence measurements and camera coordinates. This is my land. This is enough. She closed the notebook. Outside, the mountain was quiet in the specific enormous way it was quiet on cold, clear nights. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something older and larger than sound. The deep stillness of a landscape that had been here before any of the people who argued over it and would be here long after. The fireplace was going. The decoration on the mantel caught the light. The generator ran clean. She sat by the fire and didn't feel triumphant or relieved or even particularly settled. She just felt like herself, the specific, unspectacular, competent version of herself that she'd built out here over 11 years of early mornings and hard winters and work that didn't ask for an audience. She'd come to Blackstone Ridge looking for quiet. She'd had to fight for it, which she hadn't expected. But it was hers. That was the thing nobody had understood. Not Mercer, not the hunters who'd laughed at her signs, not the deputies who'd taken 18 months to act. The thing they'd all misread, looking at a quiet woman alone on a mountain and seeing someone who could be moved. Quiet is not the same as empty. Stillness is not the same as surrender. And the most dangerous thing you can do is mistake someone's patience for the absence of power. Because patience, in the right hands, is not waiting. It is preparation. And some people have been preparing for longer than you know.